Tonight, I want to take you somewhere you've never been. Somewhere dark and frightening and impossibly distant, yet somehow still relevant, still touching your life in ways you might not realize. I want to take you to the 14th century, to a small English village in the year 1348, to a moment in history when the world ended, not metaphorically, not dramatically, but truly, actually ended for millions of people. When an invisible enemy swept across Europe and killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of everyone who lived there. When entire villages were wiped from the map. When the structures of society collapsed. When the future itself became uncertain. I want to take you there not to frighten you, though it is frightening. Not to depress you, though it is heartbreaking. But to show you something important, something that might matter to you right now, in whatever time you're living in, whatever challenges you're facing. I want to show you that humans endure, that we faced catastrophe before and survived, that the world has ended before and life has continued anyway, that even in the darkest times, people found ways to keep going, to rebuild, to create meaning from chaos and hope from despair. The plague that swept through Europe in 1348 later called the Black Death, though people at the time didn't call it that, didn't have a name for it except the pestilence or the mortality, killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe alone. Some historians think the number was higher. Some think it might have been as high as 50 million worldwide. Those numbers are so large, they become abstract, meaningless. How do you comprehend 25 million deaths? How do you make that real? Make it human? Make it something you can actually understand? You can't, really. Not from statistics. Not from numbers in history books. The only way to understand it is to make it personal. To follow one person, one family, one village through the catastrophe. To see what they saw, feel what they felt, face the impossible choices they faced. That's what this story is. It's not a comprehensive history of the Black Death. There are excellent books and documentaries that cover that. This is something different. This is one man's experience, one family's survival, one village's collapse and painful rebirth. His name is Thomas. He's not a real person. I've created him, synthesized him from historical records and contemporary accounts and archaeological evidence. But everything he experiences, everything he sees, everything he feels, that's all real. That's all based on what actually happened to millions of people across Europe in 1348 and 1349. Thomas is 29 years old. He's a peasant farmer in a small village called Ashwell, about 12 miles from Bristol, in the west of England. He has a wife named Eleanor, a daughter named Margaret who's 6, and a son named William who's 3. He works a strip of land that his family has worked for generations, growing wheat and vegetables, raising a pig and a few chickens, living the hard but predictable life that peasants had lived for centuries. He has no idea that everything is about to change. He doesn't know that in the port of Bristol, just 6 miles away, ships are unloading cargo from infected ports in France. He doesn't know that rats are scurrying off those ships, carrying fleas in their fur, and those fleas carrying a bacterium called Yersinia pestis in their guts. He doesn't know what bacteria are. He doesn't understand how disease spreads. He thinks illness comes from bad air or divine punishment or sometimes just random misfortune. This ignorance isn't stupidity. It's just the reality of living in the 14th century, when the sum total of human medical knowledge was a confused mixture of ancient Greek theories, religious explanations, and folk wisdom passed down through generations. And because he doesn't understand, he can't protect himself. None of them can. When the plague arrives in Ashwell, and it will arrive, carried by a traveling merchant who feels a bit tired, a bit feverish, but nothing serious, nothing worth mentioning, it will spread with shocking speed. Within weeks, people Thomas has known his entire life will be dead. Within months, more than half the village will be gone. And Thomas will have to figure out how to survive, not just physically, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. How to keep going when everyone around you is dying. How to protect your family when you don't know what you're protecting them from. How to maintain your sanity and your humanity when the world has gone mad. This is his story. It's a story about survival, but not the Hollywood kind of survival where the hero fights and wins. This is quieter survival, grimmer survival. The kind where victory means simply waking up alive one more day, where courage means getting out of bed even when you want to give up, where hope is a fragile and irrational thing that you cling to because the alternative is unbearable. It's also a story about community, about what happens when the bonds that hold society together start to fray and break, about the darkness that emerges when law and order collapse, about the unexpected moments of grace and kindness that shine all the brighter for the surrounding darkness. And ultimately, it's a story about resilience, about the stubborn human refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming catastrophe, about the ways we find meaning and purpose, even when the universe seems fundamentally meaningless and cruel. I'm not going to lie to you. This story gets dark. It gets hard. There are moments of genuine horror, moments of heartbreaking loss, moments where you might want to turn it off, to escape back to the safety of your present day. But I hope you'll stay with it, because the darkness isn't the point. The point is what comes after. The point is the morning that arrives after even the longest night. The point is that Thomas survives, and his children survive, and life continues. And that matters. That matters for you, whoever you are, whenever you're listening to this. Because you're going to face catastrophes in your own life. Maybe you're facing one right now. Maybe it's personal illness, loss, grief, trauma. Maybe it's collective economic crisis, political upheaval, pandemic, climate disaster. And when you face those catastrophes, it helps to know that others have faced similar darkness and survived. It helps to know that endurance is possible, that rebuilding is possible, that life can continue even when it seems impossible. So let me take you to Ashwell in 1348. Let me show you what it was like to live through the end of the world. Let me introduce you to Thomas and Eleanor and Margaret and William and the other people of this small village who didn't know they were living through one of history's greatest catastrophes, who were just trying to survive one more day. The story starts on a quiet June night with a man lying in his bed, listening to his family breathe, thinking about the work he needs to do tomorrow, completely unaware that his whole world is about to change. Let's begin. The year is 1348. It's early June, and you're lying in your bed in a small village about 12 miles east of Bristol, in the west of England. Your name is Thomas, though most people call you Tom, and you're 29 years old. That makes you what people in your time would consider well into adulthood, past the flush of youth, but not yet old, not by the standards of those who survived childhood. You've got a wife named Eleanor, a daughter named Margaret who's 6, and a son named William who's 3. You work a strip of land that your father worked before you, and his father before him, going back as far as anyone can remember. The cottage where you sleep is small. One room, maybe 18 feet by 14 feet, with walls made of wattle and gob-woven sticks plastered over with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that dries hard as stone. The roof above your head is thatch, bundled reeds and straw laid thick and overlapping, patched in places where the rain has found ways through. There's a hearth in the center of the room, just a circle of stones set into the packed earth floor, where a small fire smolders even now, sending thin wisps of smoke up toward the hole in the roof that serves as your only chimney. You can smell everything in the darkness. Wood smoke, always wood smoke, mixed with the earthy scent of the dirt floor, the musty sweetness of the straw mattress beneath. You, the warm animal smell from the corner where your 3 chickens roost on their perch, and the family's single pig shifts and grunts in its sleep. The pig's name is Grunter, which your son William finds endlessly hilarious, and Grunter shares this single room with your entire family because in winter, that pig's body heat might mean the difference between waking up cold and waking up frozen. There's no glass in your window, just a wooden shutter that you've pulled closed against the night. No candles burning now. Tallow candles are expensive, and you save them for when you really need them, for the dark mornings before dawn when work must begin, or the long winter evenings when there's mending to be done. Tonight, the only light comes from the faint red glow of the embers in the hearth, barely enough to see the shapes of your sleeping family. Eleanor breathes softly beside you, her back curved against your chest. Margaret and William are on their own small pallet near the far wall, two little bodies curled together like puppies. You can just make out the rise and fall of their breathing. The night is quiet except for these sounds, except for the occasional creak of the house settling, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the darkness beyond your walls, the soft rustle of Grunter shifting his weight. This is your world. This room, this family, this plot of land. You were born in this village. You will die in this village. Your grandfather's bones lie in the churchyard, not 200 paces from where you sleep. And someday, your bones will lie there too, and your children's bones after yours. This is not sad to you. This is simply how things are, how they have always been, how they will always be. The world is vast and unknowable beyond the boundaries of your village, but this small patch of earth is yours, and that is enough. Tomorrow will be much like today. You'll wake before dawn, cross yourself, and thank God for another morning. Pull on your rough woolen tunic and your leather belt and your shoes that are more patches than original leather. You'll eat a piece of yesterday's bread soaked in weak ale. You'll walk to the fields and work until your back aches and your hands are raw, planting or weeding or harvesting, depending on the season, giving 3 days of your labor each week to your Lord and working your own strip the other days, hoping that the weather holds, hoping that the crops grow, hoping that you can grow enough to feed your family and still have something left to sell at market for the few pennies you need for the things you cannot make yourself. It's a hard life, but it's your life, and you're grateful for it. You've seen harder. You remember the great famine of your youth, when you were barely 10 years old, when the rains came and would not stop, and the grain rotted in the fields, and people ate things that should not be eaten. You remember your mother's sister, your Aunt Catherine, how her cheeks went hollow and her eyes grew huge in her skull, and then one morning she simply didn't wake up. You remember the winter when your family ate bark bread and counted themselves lucky to have it. So yes, life is hard, but you have food more often than not. You have a roof over your head. You have your wife and your children. You have the rhythm of the seasons and the turning of the year and the familiar faces of your neighbors who have known you since you were born. You have the church with its stone walls and its painted saints and the priest's voice chanting in Latin that you do understand, but that soothes you anyway, connecting you to God and to something larger than yourself. You have no idea that everything is about to change. You have no idea that 6 miles away in the port of Bristol sailors are unloading cargo from ships that sailed up from the southern coast, from a place called Melcombe in Dorset, where just last month in late May, another ship arrived carrying men and goods from Gascony in France. You have no idea that among those sailors there was one who felt tired, feverish, who dismissed it as merely the exhaustion of the voyage, who came ashore and walked the docks and touched ropes and crates and door frames and the shoulders of friends, greeting him after his time at sea. You have no idea that in his blood, and in the blood of the rats that scurried off that ship when it docked, and in the guts of the fleas that lived on those rats, there swarms a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, though of course you've never heard that name and won't for another 500 years. You have no idea what a bacterium is. You have no idea what causes disease at all, really, beyond the vague understanding that bad air can make you sick, that God punishes sin with suffering, that sometimes illness simply happens, and there's nothing to be done about it but pray. You have no idea that this particular illness, this particular invisible enemy, is about to kill somewhere between 30 and 60% of everyone you know. You have no idea that by this time next year, your village will be so empty that walking down the main road will feel like walking through a dream, like moving through a place where ghosts have replaced the living. Right now, in this moment, lying in your bed in the darkness, listening to your wife breathe and your children sleep, and your pig grunt contentedly in the corner, everything is fine. Everything is normal. Tomorrow will come, and it will be much like today, and the day after will be much like tomorrow, and life will continue in its familiar patterns, just as it always has. This is the last moment of the old world. This is the last breath of an age that's ending, though you don't know it yet. This is before the bells start ringing, before the dying begins, before fear becomes something you carry with you, like a second skin, so constant you almost stop noticing it's there. Sleep, Thomas. Sleep while you still can, while the world is still whole, while your children are still healthy, while your future still looks like your past. Tomorrow the sun will rise as it always does. The church bells will ring for matins as they always do. You'll go to the fields and work and come home tired and eat your evening meal and sleep again. For now, everything is fine. For now. The village of Ashwell, that's the name of your home, though it is small enough that most maps don't bother marking it, sits in a shallow valley with fields stretching out on all sides, divided into long strips that different families work. There are perhaps 40 families here, maybe 200 souls all told, though the exact number varies depending on births and deaths, and the occasional person who gets permission from the Lord to marry someone from another village and moves away. The village is laid out simply. There's the church, of course, the stone church of St. Mary that's been here for more than 200 years, with its bell tower visible from anywhere in the village. There's the manor house where Sir Robert Blackwood lives, though he's often away on business or at court or tending to his other properties. There's the mill down by the stream where everyone brings their grain to be ground, paying a portion to Sir Robert for the privilege. There's the smithy where old John hammers out tools and shoes horses and fixes the metal bits on plows and carts. There's a scattering of houses and cottages, some larger with 2 rooms, some tiny like yours, all clustered together in the center of the village for safety and companionship. Beyond the houses stretch the fields divided into those long strips, some owned by the church, some by Sir Robert, some worked by families like yours, who owe labor and rents in exchange for the right to grow food on them. Beyond the fields lie the common lands where everyone has the right to graze their animals or gather firewood, and beyond that, the forest dark and dense, where wolves still roam and where people only go when they must for hunting or for gathering nuts and mushrooms in the autumn. Everyone here knows everyone else. You grew up playing with Peter the miller's son, who's now Peter the miller himself, since old Peter died 5 winters back. You danced at Eleanor's sister's wedding. You stood as godfather when your neighbor John's 3rd child was baptized. When someone falls ill, the whole village knows by evening. When someone dies, everyone attends the funeral. When there's a feast day, everyone celebrates together in the church or on the village green. This closeness is comfort and curse both. Comfort, because you're never truly alone, because help is always near if you need it, because you're part of something larger than yourself. Curse, because there are no secrets here, because everyone knows everyone's business, because a quarrel or a grudge can poison the air for months, because there's no escape from the judgment of your neighbors if you do something that earns their disapproval. But mostly, it's comfort. Mostly it's good to know that when harvest time comes, 20 men will turn out to help bring in the grain before the rains can ruin it. Good to know that when your cow is sick, someone will have a remedy to suggest, some herb or prayer or ritual that their grandmother swore by. Good to know that your children play with other children, learning the songs and games that their parents played, that their grandparents played, stretching back through generations. The rhythm of life here is dictated by the sun and the seasons and the church calendar. You wake when the sky begins to lighten. You work until the sun sets. You sleep when it's dark. Spring means plowing and planting. Summer means weeding and praying for good. Whether autumn means harvest and the desperate rush to gather everything before the frost comes. Winter means huddling close to the fire and making do with what you've stored, and always, always hoping that you've stored enough. The church marks the year with its own rhythms. Christmas and Easter are the great festivals, but there are dozens of saints' days too. Days when you're supposed to rest from labor and attend Mass and remember whoever it is that day commemorates. The feast of St. John the Baptist in late June, Michaelmas in September, All Saints' Day in November. Each one breaks up the monotony of work, gives you something to look forward to, reminds you that life is more than just endless labor in the fields. You're not an educated man. You can't read or write, and neither can Eleanor. The priest can read Latin, but most of that goes over your head when you hear it. What you know from doing, from watching your father and learning by imitation, from listening to the older men and women share their wisdom and their warnings. You know how to guide a plow, how to sow seed evenly, how to tell when the grain is ready for harvest by the color and the feel of it. You know which herbs might ease a fever, which prayers are most efficacious for which purposes, which stars tell you that spring is truly here and winter's grip has finally loosened. You know your place in the grand scheme of things. God made the world and put everyone in their proper station. The king rules England by divine right, appointed by God himself. Below the king are the nobles, and the knights and the lords like Sir Robert, who own the land and administer justice and protect their people from bandits and foreign invaders. Below them come people like you, the peasants and farmers and craftsmen, who work the land and make the things that everyone needs to survive. And below you, well, there's really no one below you, except beggars and criminals and the truly destitute. This hierarchy is not something you question. It's simply the way things are, the way things have always been, the way God ordained them to be. To question it would be to question God himself, and that way lies sin and damnation. Your priest reminds you of this regularly. Accept your lot in life. Work hard. Be grateful for what you have. Obey your superiors. Pay your tithes and your rents and your taxes. Keep your head down and your prayers sincere, and God will reward you in the next life, even if this life is hard. And this life is hard, no question about it. The work never ends. Your hands are permanently calloused, your back permanently bent from stooping over in the fields. In winter, you're cold, and in summer, you're hot, and there's never quite enough food, never quite enough rest, never quite enough of anything except work. Disease takes children with shocking regularity. You've buried one already, a little girl named Alice, who died in her second year from a fever that no herb or prayer could touch. Accidents happen too. Your neighbor Stephen lost 3 fingers to an axe that slipped. Peter, the miller's youngest son, drowned in the stream during a spring flood. Death is always close in this world, always waiting, always ready to reach out and take someone you love. You've learned not to get too attached to infants until they make it past their first year, because so many don't. You've learned not to count on tomorrow, because tomorrow isn't promised to anyone. You've learned to find joy in small things, a sunny day, a full belly, the sound of your children laughing, the warmth of your wife beside you in the night. And mostly, most days, that's enough. Most days you don't think about how hard your life is. You just live it. You get up, you work, you eat, you sleep, you get up again. The seasons turn, the years pass. Children are born and old people die, and the village continues, generation after generation, unchanging and eternal. Or so you think. It's June now, early June 1348, and the weather is unusually wet. It's been raining for days, off and on, Heavy downpours that turn the roads to mud and make working in the fields miserable. The wheat is growing well enough, at least drinking in all this water, but there's worry already about whether it will dry out enough when harvest time comes. Grain needs to be dry when you store it, or it will rot, and if the grain rots, then winter will be hungry. But that's 2 months away. 3 months maybe. For now, there's weeding to be done, rain or no rain, because the weeds don't care about the weather, and if you let them get ahead of you, they'll choke out your crops, and then where will you be? So you pull on your thinnest tunic, the one that won't be too heavy when it gets soaked, and you wrap a piece of oiled cloth around your shoulders for what little protection it offers, and you head out to the fields. The road through the village is a river of mud. Your shoes make sucking sounds with every step. Other men are heading out too, moving through the rain with their heads down and their shoulders hunched, everyone grimly determined to get the work done. You exchange nods, maybe a few words about the weather, but mostly you just walk in silence, saving your energy for the work ahead. The field is a misery, as you knew it would be. The earth is so waterlogged that every step you take sinks half a foot into the muck. Your hands are cold and slippery. The weeds pull up easily, at least, their roots loosened by all this moisture, but you're soaked through within minutes, and there's hours of work ahead. You don't complain. What would be the point? The work has to be done, complaining or not. So you bend to your task, pulling weeds, tossing them aside, moving slowly down your strip of land, trying not to think about how far you still have to go, trying not to think about anything except the next weed, and the next, and the next. Around midday, Eleanor appears with a bit of bread and some ale, holding a piece of cloth over her head against the rain. You straighten up, feeling your back creak in protest, and take the food gratefully. The bread is yesterday's, hard and a little moldy, but you eat it anyway, washing it down with the sour ale. Eleanor doesn't stay long. She's got her own work to do, minding the children and the pig and the garden plot behind her cottage, where she grows cabbages and onions and beans. Are you well? She asks, and you nod, because what else would you say? You're cold and wet and tired, but that's nothing unusual, nothing worth remarking on. The children? You ask. Well enough. William's got the sniffles again, but nothing serious. You nod again. William always has the sniffles, it seems like. He's a delicate child, small for his age, prone to coughs and fevers that scare you half to death every time they come on. But he always recovers. Children do, usually. Until they don't. Eleanor kisses your cheek, gives your shoulder a squeeze, and then she's gone, hurrying back through the rain toward home. You watch her go for a moment. This woman who's been your wife for 7 years now, who you've known since you were children yourselves. Her father and your father arranged the marriage, as is proper, but you've been lucky. You care for her. She cares for you. She works as hard as you do, in her own way, and she has given you 2 living children, and buried one with you, and never complained about her lot. That's all you can ask for, really. That's more than some people get. You turn back to your weeding. The rain continues. The day crawls forward. By evening, you're so cold, you can barely feel your fingers. You trudge home through the mud every step and effort, thinking of nothing but the fire and dry clothes and maybe, if you're lucky, a bowl of pottage, the thick vegetable stew that Eleanor makes, flavored with whatever she can find, sometimes a bit of bacon, if you're fortunate, usually just beans and cabbage and onions cooked until they're soft. The cottage is warm and smoky and blessedly dry. You peel off your soaked tunic and hang it near the fire to dry, shivering in just your undershirt. Margaret and William are playing some game with pebbles on the floor, and they look up when you come in, and William runs over to throw his arms around your legs. "Papa," he says, and you ruffle his hair, feeling something in your chest unclench a little bit. This is why you work so hard. This is what it's all for. These children, this family, this small warm space in a cold and difficult world. Eleanor hands you a bowl of pottage and a cup of ale, and you sit on your stool by the fire, feeling the warmth seep slowly back into your bones. The pottage is thin tonight, more water than vegetables, but it's hot, and it fills your belly, and that's enough. You watch your children play. You listen to Eleanor hum softly as she moves around the room, tidying up, banking the fire for the night. You feel, for this moment at least, content. Outside, the rain continues to fall, steady and relentless. The world is gray and wet and cold. But in here, in this small room, there's warmth and light and family. There's safety. There's home. You have no idea that 6 miles away, in Bristol, a man has just died in circumstances that his family cannot understand. He seemed fine yesterday. He complained of feeling tired, of a headache, but nothing serious. Then this morning, he woke with a fever, and by afternoon, there were swellings in his groin, hard lumps the size of eggs that hurt when anyone touched them. By evening, he was delirious, thrashing and crying out, and by midnight, he was dead. His family is terrified and bewildered. They've sent for the priest to pray for his soul. They've sent for neighbors to help them wash the body and prepare it for burial. They don't know what killed him. They don't know that his death is just the first of thousands. They don't know that within a week, 5 more people on his street will show the same symptoms. They don't know that the illness he died of is about to spread through Bristol like fire through dry grass, and then out from Bristol to all the surrounding countryside, following the roads and the rivers, touching everyone it encounters. They don't know, and you don't know, and nobody knows, because the plague doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send messengers ahead. It just comes, quiet and implacable, and begins its work of destruction. But tonight, in your cottage in Ashwell, everything is still fine. Tonight you're warm and fed and surrounded by your family. Tonight the world makes sense, follows its familiar patterns, continues as it has always continued. Sleep well, Thomas. Tomorrow is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. 3 weeks later, everything is changed. Not in Ashwell, not yet. In Ashwell, life continues its normal rhythms. The rain has finally stopped, and the sun has come out, and the fields are drying, and everyone is relieved because the weather is cooperating, and the wheat looks promising, and maybe this will be a good harvest year after all. But there are rumors now. Travelers passing through bring news from Bristol, strange and frightening news. There's a sickness there, they say. A terrible sickness. People falling ill and dying within days, sometimes within hours. The bodies piling up so fast that the gravediggers can't keep pace with them. Whole streets abandoned as families flee the city, trying to escape whatever evil has taken root there. You hear these stories in the tavern, because even though ale costs money, you don't really have. Sometimes a man needs to sit with other men and drink and talk, needs to escape the relentless grind of work for just an hour or two. The tavern is just a room in Peter the miller's house, but Peter's wife makes good ale, and she's got a few benches and a table, and it's become the place where the men of the village gather when they can spare the time and the penny or two for a cup. Tonight there are 8 or 9 men crammed into that small room, and the talk is all of Bristol and the sickness there. Old Henry, who claims to have an uncle who lives in Bristol, though you're not sure that's true, says his uncle sent word that 1,000 people have died already. 1,000 people. The number is so large you can barely comprehend it. That's 5 times the population of Ashwell. That's more people than you've ever seen gathered in one place in your entire life. Can't be true, says John the blacksmith, shaking his head. 1,000 people? That's not possible. It's true, Henry insists. My uncle don't lie. He says you can smell the death in the air. Says they're burying bodies in pits, a dozen at a time, because there's no room left in the churchyards. But what is it, you ask? What's causing it? Henry shrugs. Nobody knows. Some say it's bad air rising from the marshes. Some say it's God's punishment for sin. Some say, double quotes, he lowers his voice, looking around as if worried about being overheard. Some say it's the Jews, poisoning the wells. That's nonsense, Peter the miller says firmly. There aren't even any Jews left in England. King Edward expelled them all 50 years ago. Well, maybe it was the Jews somewhere else then, Henry says defensively. Maybe in France or somewhere, and the poison got into the water and flowed here. You all fall silent, considering this. The logic seems shaky. How would poison in French wells affect English people? But then again, who really understands how these things work? Disease is mysterious. It comes and goes according to its own inscrutable rules, or according to God's will, which amounts to the same thing. My cousin saw a beggar on the road last week, says young Robert, Sir Robert's son, who sometimes drinks with the common folk when his father isn't watching. Said the man looked sick, had sores on his face, was raving about the end of the world. Wouldn't let anyone near him. Just kept walking toward Bristol, muttering to himself. Did your cousin give him anything? Peter asks. Robert shakes his head. Wouldn't go near him. Said the man looked like death itself. Another silence. You all drink your ale and avoid each other's eyes. These stories are frightening, but Bristol is 6 miles away, and 6 miles is a long distance. 6 miles is far enough that Bristol might as well be another kingdom, another world entirely. Whatever is happening there probably won't reach Ashwell. Probably. We should pray, says Martin, one of the older farmers. That's all we can do. Pray to God and the Virgin to protect us from whatever evil is plaguing Bristol. Everyone nods. That makes sense. That's something you can do. You'll go to church on Sunday, and you'll pray extra hard, and you'll light candles if you can afford them, and maybe God will hear you and keep the sickness away from Ashwell. The conversation moves on to other topics, after that to the price of grain, to Sir Robert's decision to enclose part of the common land for his sheep, to whether Martin's daughter is really being courted by that boy from the next village, or if that's just gossip. Normal things, village things. The talk of Bristol and death recedes into the background, something distant and abstract, something that happens to other people in other places. You walk home in the summer twilight, feeling the ale warm in your belly, feeling the soft evening air on your face after so many days of rain. The sky is streaked with pink and orange, beautiful in the way that only a country sky can be beautiful, vast and open and endless. Swallows dive and wheel overhead, catching insects in mid-flight. From somewhere nearby, you hear a woman singing, her voice rising and falling in a melody you recognize but can't quite place. The world is beautiful tonight. The world is peaceful. Whatever is happening in Bristol has nothing to do with you, with your village, with your life. You're safe here. You've always been safe here, or so you tell yourself. 2 days later, a man collapses in the middle of the village green. His name is Geoffrey, and he's a wool merchant, or at least he deals in wool, buying fleeces from farmers in all the surrounding villages, and then selling them on to the great merchants who ship the wool to Flanders, where it will be woven into cloth. He travels constantly, Geoffrey does, always on the road between villages, always making deals, always calculating profits. He's just arrived in Ashwell this morning, leading a small cart pulled by a donkey, and he's set up on the green to conduct business with anyone who has wool to sell. Several men have already come to haggle with him over prices, when suddenly, mid-sentence, mid-word even, he just stops. His face goes gray. His eyes roll back in his head. And then he's on the ground, shaking and convulsing, foam flecking his lips. People gather around, unsure what to do. Is he having a fit? Has he been struck by some evil spirit? Someone runs for Father Edmund, the priest, who might know what prayers to say. Someone else runs for old Marjorie, who knows herb lore and who has treated many illnesses in her long life. By the time they arrive, Geoffrey is unconscious but still breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid gasps. Father Edmund kneels beside him and begins to pray in Latin, making the sign of the cross over the sick man's body. Marjorie examines him, peeling back his eyelids, feeling his forehead, checking his pulse at his wrist and his throat. "He's burning with fever," she announces. "And look here." She pulls aside Geoffrey's tunic, and there, in his armpit, is a swelling, dark and hard and the size of a small apple. It looks angry, inflamed, like something trying to push its way out from under the skin. You're standing in the crowd watching all this, and you feel a sudden cold stab of fear in your belly. You've never seen anything like that before, that strange swelling. But somehow you just know, that this is connected to the stories from Bristol. This is the sickness everyone has been talking about. It's here. It's in Ashwell. It's real. Other people seem to be reaching the same conclusion. The crowd starts to back away from Geoffrey's prone form, leaving only Father Edmund and old Marjorie kneeling beside him. People are whispering, pointing, crossing themselves. You hear someone say Bristol, and someone else say plague, and that word hangs in the air like a curse. Plague. You're not even sure what the word means, really, beyond sickness or pestilence, but you know enough to be afraid of it. Your grandmother used to tell stories about a great plague that swept through England when she was young, killing thousands. You'd always thought they were just stories, the kind of exaggerated tales old people tell. But maybe they weren't. Maybe they were memories. "We need to get him inside," Father Edmund says, standing up, away from everyone else. "And we need to pray. All of us. This may be a test from God." 4 men volunteer, or rather, are volunteered by the priest to carry Geoffrey to the church, where there's a small room that can be used as a sick room. They're nervous about touching him. You can see that. But they do it anyway, because what else can they do? You can't just leave a man lying on the ground to die. They carry him away, and the crowd disperses slowly, people talking in low, worried voices. You walk home with a heavy feeling in your chest, like something has shifted, like some invisible barrier has been breached. Eleanor sees your face when you come through the door. "What is it?" she asks immediately. "What's happened?" You tell her about Geoffrey, about the fever and the swelling, about the way people were whispering plague in frightened tones. Eleanor's face goes pale. "Is it the Bristol sickness?" She asks. "I don't know," you say, though you suspect it is. "Maybe. Father Edmund is going to pray for him. We should keep the children inside," Eleanor says. Just for now. Until we know more." You nod. That seems wise. Margaret is disappointed. She'd been planning to go play with her friends this afternoon, but she doesn't argue when Eleanor tells her to stay home. Even a 6-year-old can sense when something is wrong, when the adults are afraid. That night you lie awake, long after everyone else has fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of the darkness, wondering what's going to happen. Is Geoffrey going to recover? Is this sickness going to spread? How do you even protect yourself from something you can't see, can't understand, can't predict? You don't have answers to any of these questions. Nobody does. So you lie there in the dark, feeling small and helpless and afraid, and eventually, finally, exhaustion pulls you down into uneasy sleep. Geoffrey dies before morning. Father Edmund finds him when he comes to check on him at first light. Dead, already cold, with more of those dark swellings visible now on his neck and in his groin. Father Edmund performs the last rites, even though Geoffrey is past hearing them, because it's the right thing to do, because every soul deserves the proper prayers before it departs this world for the next. They bury Geoffrey that same day in a corner of the churchyard without much ceremony. His family is elsewhere, back in whatever town he calls home, and nobody here knows how to reach them. So he goes into the ground with only a handful of villagers watching, and Father Edmund saying the words, "And that's the end of Geoffrey, the wool merchant." Except it's not the end. Of course it's not the end, because 3 days after Geoffrey dies, 2 more people fall ill with the same symptoms. The same sudden fever, the same dark swellings. Old Henry, who'd been boasting about his uncle in Bristol, and a young woman named Alice, who helps Father Edmund keep the church clean. And then 2 days after that, 4 more. And then, and then, and then. It spreads like something alive, like something hunting. You start to feel like you're living in a nightmare, like reality is cracked open, and something terrible has crawled through the gap. Every morning you wake up wondering who will be sick today, who will die today. Every evening you go to bed grateful that you and your family are still healthy, and terrified that tomorrow that will change. The village responds the way villages do, with a mixture of practical measures and desperate prayers. Father Edmund holds special masses every day now, praying for God's mercy, for deliverance from this pestilence. People light candles until the church smells like hot wax and smoke. They confess their sins, convinced that somehow their transgressions have brought this down upon them, that if they can just be pure enough, good enough, God will relent and lift this curse. Old Marjorie tries every remedy she knows. Herbs and poultices and bitter draughts that taste like punishment. She lances the swellings, trying to drain the poison she thinks is trapped inside, but it doesn't help. Nothing helps. The sick either recover, which is rare, maybe 1 in 10, or they die, usually within 3 days of the first symptoms appearing. People start avoiding each other. The easy camaraderie of village life disappears, replaced by suspicion and fear. Everyone is watching everyone else for signs of illness. A cough, a fever, a complaint about feeling tired. Any of these might be the first symptom, the beginning of the end. Families start keeping to themselves, closing their doors, refusing visitors. You do the same. What else can you do? You can't risk your children's lives, can't risk Eleanor's life, can't risk bringing this thing into your home. So you stay inside as much as possible, going out only when you must, to tend the fields or fetch water, or buy what little food is available. When you do go out, you avoid other people, giving them a wide berth, not making eye contact, hurrying back home as quickly as you can. The work in the field suffers. How can it not? Half the men are either sick themselves or caring for sick family members, or too frightened to leave their houses. The wheat needs harvesting soon, but there's no one to do it. The few men who are still working are exhausted, trying to cover the labor of 3 or 4 men each, knowing it's impossible, but trying anyway, because what else is there to do? Peter the miller is one of the first to die. Good old Peter, who made decent ale and who'd been your friend since you were boys together. He sickens on a Tuesday and dies on a Thursday, and his wife follows him into the ground 3 days later. Their children are suddenly orphans, suddenly alone in the world, and nobody knows quite what to do with them. One of Peter's brothers from the next village comes and takes the oldest boy, but the younger. 2 are left to fend for themselves, and you see them sometimes wandering the village like lost spirits, their faces blank with shock. More follow. Always more. Martin the farmer. Young Robert, Sir Robert's son, which causes a tremendous scandal, because how can nobility die of the same disease as peasants? If God favors the highborn, as everyone has always believed, then why doesn't he protect them from this? The blacksmith John survives, but his wife and 2 of his 3 children die. The village begins to feel empty, hollow, like a place abandoned by God. The worst part is how quickly it happens. One day someone is fine, healthy, going about their business. The next day they're sick. The day after that they're dying. The day after that they're in the ground. There's no time to prepare yourself. No time to say a proper goodbye. No time for anything except shock and grief, and then the sick realization that there will be another death tomorrow, and another the day after that, and you have no idea when or if it will ever stop. You keep your family inside as much as you can, but you can't keep them locked up forever. You need food. You need water. You need firewood for cooking. These things don't appear on their own. Someone has to venture out and get them, and that someone is usually you, because you'd rather risk yourself than risk Eleanor or the children. Every time you leave the house, you wonder if this is it. If this is the time you'll encounter whatever invisible miasma carries the sickness. If this is the moment when death touches you. Every time you come back inside, you feel a wash of relief so intense it makes your knees weak. Another day survived. Another day when your family is still whole. But the fear never leaves. It lives inside you now, constant and grinding, like hunger or like pain. The fear that tomorrow will be different. That tomorrow, the sickness will find its way inside your home, will touch your wife or your children, will tear apart everything you've been so desperately trying to protect. You pray more than you ever have before. You pray until the words lose meaning, until they're just sounds you make to fill the terrible silence. You pray to God and to Mary, and to all the saints whose names you can remember. You make promises, I'll be better, I'll work harder, I'll never complain. Just please, please, please let my family live. You don't know if God is listening. You don't know if prayers even work. But what else do you have? What else is there to do? The summer days stretch on, hot and bright and beautiful, indifferent to human suffering. The wheat ripens in the fields, golden and heavy-headed, ready for harvest. But there's no one left to harvest it. The few men who are still healthy are too busy burying the dead or caring for the sick, or simply trying to survive themselves. You watch from your doorway as the wheat begins to droop. As the heads grow so heavy, they bend the stalks nearly to the ground. In a normal year, this would be a disaster, the whole harvest lost, starvation certain in the winter to come. But this isn't a normal year. This is a year when death walks openly through the streets. This is a year when the normal rules no longer seem to apply. Maybe the wheat doesn't matter anymore. Maybe nothing matters anymore except staying alive for one more day. A thing about the sickness, the plague, as everyone calls it now, though the word still sounds strange and foreign in your mouth, is that nobody understands it. Nobody knows where it comes from, how it spreads, why it strikes some people and spares others. This ignorance is almost worse than the disease itself. At least with a known enemy, you can plan, can defend yourself, can fight back in some meaningful way. But how do you fight something you can't see? How do you defend against an enemy that strikes without warning and without mercy? The theories multiply, each one more desperate and contradictory than the last. Father Edmund preaches that the plague is God's punishment for sin, for the wickedness of mankind, for turning away from righteousness. He urges everyone to repent, to confess their sins, to pray harder and with more devotion. And people do, they try, but the deaths continue anyway, and the question hangs unspoken in the air. If this is God as punishment, what exactly are we being punished for? What sin could possibly warrant this? Old Marjorie and the other women who know healing say it's bad air, miasma rising from swamps or from the earth itself when conditions are right. They recommend carrying bunches of herbs, breathing through cloth soaked in vinegar, avoiding low-lying areas where the bad air might collect. Some people follow this advice religiously, walking around with lavender and rosemary held to their noses, but it doesn't seem to make any difference. There are wilder theories too. Some say it's the alignment of planets causing corruption in the atmosphere. Some say it's earthquakes releasing poisonous vapors from deep underground. There was an earthquake in Italy a few years back, wasn't there? Maybe that's what started all this. Some even whisper that it's witchcraft, that someone somewhere has cursed the whole world, though nobody can say who or why. And always there are those who blame the Jews. Even though there are no Jews in England anymore, even though that makes no logical sense, people need someone to blame, and the Jews have always been convenient scapegoats. You hear stories, probably not true, hopefully not true, of Jewish communities in other countries being massacred, burned alive by mobs, convinced that the Jews poisoned the wells, or conspired with the devil, or committed some other unthinkable evil. It's madness. All of it is madness. But when you're terrified and helpless and watching everyone you know die around you, madness starts to look reasonable. At least madness gives you something to do, someone to blame, some illusion of control over the uncontrollable. The treatments are worse than useless. They're actively harmful, though nobody realizes this. When someone falls sick, old Marjorie is called, and she arrives with her bag of tools and herbs, and she sets to work with the best intentions and the worst possible methods. She believes in the theory of humors, that the body contains 4 essential fluids that must be kept in balance: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you're sick, it means your humors are out of balance, and the cure is to rebalance them. For the plague, with its high fevers and angry swellings, she decides that patients have too much blood, too much heat. So she bleeds them. She makes small cuts in their arms or legs, and lets blood flow into a bowl until the patient is pale and weak. Or she applies leeches, fat black things that attach themselves to skin and swell as they drink. The patients don't improve. How could they? They're already fighting a terrible infection, already depleted and feverish, and bleeding them just makes them weaker. But Marjorie doesn't know this. She's doing what she's been taught, what her grandmother taught her, what everyone believes is the proper treatment. She also lenses the buboes, those dark swellings in the groin and armpit and neck. She cuts them open with a knife, releasing pus and blood and a smell so foul it makes strong men gag. The idea is to let the poison out, to relieve the pressure, to help the body heal. But of course, all this does is spread the infection, create new wounds that become infected themselves, add trauma to a body that's already failing. Some people survive these treatments anyway, because they're strong or lucky, or because the plague itself runs its course and releases its grip. But most die, and the ones who survive often bear terrible scars, puckered and discolored where the buboes were lanced, marks that will follow them for the rest of their lives. You watch Marjorie work one afternoon, called to a neighbor's house where the man of the family has fallen ill. You're there to help hold the patient down if needed, to fetch water, to do whatever Marjorie asks. The sick man, his name is William, like your son, though everyone calls him Will, to avoid confusion lies on a pallet near the fire, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. Marjorie examines him, her face grave. "The fever's very high," she says. "And look," she pulls aside his tunic, and there are the buboes, 3 of them, 1 in each armpit and 1 in his groin, dark and swollen and angry looking. "We need to let the poison out," she says, more to herself than to anyone else. She reaches into her bag and pulls out a small, sharp knife. You watch as she makes the first incision, cutting into the bubo in his left armpit. Will screams, tries to pull away, but his wife holds him down, tears streaming down her face. Blood and pus flow from the wound, thick and dark and foul-smelling. Marjorie packs the wound with cloth, then moves to the next bubo. The whole process takes maybe 10 minutes, but it feels like hours. Will is sobbing by the end of it, exhausted and in terrible pain. Marjorie gives him something to drink, some bitter herbal mixture that's supposed to help with the fever, and then she's done. She washes her hands in a basin, dries them on her apron, and looks at Will's wife with an expression you can't quite read. "Pray," Marjorie says quietly. "That's all we can do now. Pray." Will dies that night. The lancing didn't help. Nothing helps. And Marjorie, you notice, is starting to look different. Older, more tired. There's something in her eyes that wasn't there before, something that looks like doubt. How many people has she treated now? 30? 40? And how many have survived? 3, maybe 4. At what point do you start to question whether you're helping at all? At what point do you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you don't actually know what you're doing? Father Edmund tries his own interventions. He performs exorcisms on the sick, believing that they might be possessed by evil spirits. He places holy relics, a fragment of bone from some long-dead saint, a scrap of cloth that supposedly touched the Virgin Mary's robe, on their foreheads, hoping for miraculous healing. He administers last rites so frequently that the words lose their gravity, become just another routine in a village drowning in death. None of it works. Nothing works. The plague does what it wants, takes who it wants, and all the prayers and bloodletting and herbs in the world can't stop it. The psychological toll of this helplessness is crushing. You can see it in people's faces, in the way they move, in the way they talk. Everyone looks haunted, hollowed out, like they're already dead inside and just waiting for their bodies to catch up. The normal spark of life has been extinguished, replaced by a dull, grinding fear and a bone-deep weariness that sleep can't cure. Arguments break out over the strangest things. Who should bury the dead? Who should care for the sick? Who's responsible for this catastrophe? Old grudges resurface, magnified by stress and fear. You see two men nearly come to blows over who should inherit a dead man's tools, even though neither of them is related to the deceased, and both of them might be dead themselves before the week is out. The social bonds that held the village together are fraying. The mutual obligations and courtesies that made community life bearable, these are forgotten in the scramble for survival. People steal from the dead, rifling through abandoned houses for anything of value. Families hoard food and water, refusing to share even with neighbors who help them in better times. The pretense of civilization wears thin, revealing the desperate animal underneath. And yet, strangely, there are moments of grace too. Acts of kindness that shine all the brighter for the darkness surrounding them. John the blacksmith, who lost his wife and 2 children, continues to work, making horseshoes and mending tools for anyone who needs them, refusing payment because what does money matter now anyway? Mary, a widow with no children of her own, takes in orphans, 3 of them so far, feeding them from her own meager supplies, because someone has to, and she's the one still standing. Father Edmund never stops ministering to the sick, never stops performing the last rites, even though everyone knows he's putting himself at terrible risk. He sleeps in the church now, doesn't even go home anymore, and when you see him, he looks like a walking skeleton, all hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, but still he continues. Still he does his duty. These moments give you hope, thin and fragile as it is. They remind you that humans are capable of more than just fear and selfishness. That even in the worst circumstances, some part of the human spirit refuses to be extinguished. But mostly, day to day, hour to hour, what you feel is terror. The terror of not knowing if you're safe. The terror of every small symptom, a headache, a sneeze, a moment of feeling too warm, because any of these might be the first sign. The terror of touching anything, going anywhere, being near anyone, because the sickness spreads somehow, and you don't know how, and so everything is potentially dangerous. You become paranoid. Everyone does. You start watching your family obsessively for any sign of illness. You make Eleanor promise to tell you immediately if she feels even slightly unwell. You check the children every morning and every night, feeling their foreheads for fever, looking for any redness or swelling, interrogating them about how they feel. The children sense your fear, and it frightens them. Margaret grows clingy, won't let you out of her sight, cries if you have to leave the house. William, already prone to nightmares, starts waking up screaming several times a night, convinced that monsters are coming to get him. And they are, in a way. The monster is real. It's just invisible. Sleep becomes difficult. You lie awake listening to your family breathe, counting their breaths, making sure they're all still alive. When you do sleep, your dreams are dark and chaotic, filled with images of death and decay, and you wake gasping and disoriented, unsure for a moment if the nightmare was real or not. Food becomes scarce as people stop working the fields, stop tending their gardens, stop trading with other villages. You eat less each day, stretching your supplies as far as they'll go, not knowing how long this will last, not knowing if there will be a harvest this year or food next winter. The children complain that they're hungry, and you have nothing to give them except platitudes. Be patient. God will provide. We'll get through this. Will you, though? Will you get through this? Looking around at the devastation, at the empty houses and the mass graves and the faces of the survivors, you're not sure. You're not sure at all. Sir Robert, the lord who owns all the land, including the strip your family works, has fled. He left 2 weeks ago with his entire household, packed up everything of value, and headed somewhere. No one's quite sure where. London maybe, or one of his other properties. Anywhere but here. He abandoned his peasants, left them to face the plague alone. And while part of you understands, he's trying to save his own family, same as everyone else in Other Park resents him for it. He's supposed to be your lord, your protector. But when danger came, he ran. Not that his departure makes much practical difference. The manor house stands empty, slowly falling into disrepair. The fields lie untended. The mill sits idle because Peter is dead and his sons fled and no one else knows how to run it. The whole structure of village life, the careful hierarchy and division of labor that everyone relied on, has collapsed. In a strange way, this brings a sort of dark freedom. With Sir Robert gone and the normal rules suspended, people start making decisions for themselves. A group of men breaks into Sir Robert's granary and distributes the stored grain among the families that are still alive. Technically, this is theft, but who's going to stop them? Who's going to enforce the law when the law itself has fled? Some people leave Ashwell entirely, deciding that they'd rather take their chances on the road than stay in a village that feels cursed. You watch them go, whole families loading their possessions onto carts, heading east or west or south, anywhere but here. You don't know if they're making the right choice. Maybe they'll find safety elsewhere. Maybe they'll just carry the sickness with them, spreading it to new places. There's no way to know. You think about leaving too. Eleanor brings it up one night, after the children are asleep, speaking quietly in the darkness. Maybe we should go, she says, while we still can, while we're still healthy. Go where? You ask. I don't know. Anywhere. My sister's village, maybe. Is it any better there? She's quiet for a long time. I don't know, she finally admits. And that's the problem, isn't it? The plague is everywhere, or might as well be. The stories come from all directions, Bristol. Of course, but also London, Oxford, Norwich. Towns and cities across all of England and beyond. Running might help. Or it might just mean dying somewhere else, among strangers, far from home. In the end, you decide to stay, mostly because you're too exhausted and frightened to make such a massive decision, too paralyzed by fear and uncertainty to do anything except continue as you have been. One more day. Just make it through one more day. The summer wears on. August arrives, hot and still and heavy. The wheat in the fields has gone past ripe now, is starting to shatter and fall, wasted. The gardens are overgrown with weeds. The animals, the pigs and chickens and cows that people kept, many of them, are dead now too, either from the plague or from neglect or from being slaughtered for food by desperate families. The village feels abandoned even though there are still people living here. It feels like a place where something terrible happened, where the wound is still fresh and raw. You can pinpoint the moment when you realized that the old world was truly gone, when the familiar structures that had organized village life for centuries simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. It was a Tuesday in late September. You remember the day clearly, because it was one of those perfect autumn days. Cool and clear, the sky an impossible blue, the kind of day that in any other year would have filled you with simple joy. You'd gone to the church. You still attended services when Father Edmund rang the bell, partly out of habit and partly because the church was the last place that still felt remotely normal. There were 7 people there. 7, out of a village that once held 200. Father Edmund stood at the altar, his back to the handful of parishioners, his voice barely audible as he struggled through the Latin prayers. Halfway through the service, he stopped. Just stopped. Stood there silent, his shoulders sagging, his head bowed. "Father?" someone called softly. He turned around and you saw his face, really saw it, probably for the first time in weeks. He looked ancient, older than time, his eyes empty of everything except exhaustion and grief. He looked at the 7 of you, and then he laughed, a broken, bitter song that echoed strangely in the stone church. "Why?" he said, and his voice was raw. "Why do you keep coming here? Why do you keep praying? What good has it done?" Nobody answered. What could you say? "I've prayed every day," Father Edmund continued, and now his voice was rising, cracking. "I've performed the rites. I've blessed the sick. I've buried the dead. I've done everything God asked of me and more. And for what? For what? Tell me." He stared at you, at all of you. "Tell me why God would allow this. Tell me what possible purpose this serves." You couldn't. Nobody could. You sat there in the pews, uncomfortable, frightened, unsure whether to stay or leave. This wasn't how priests were supposed to act. This wasn't how the world was supposed to work. Father Edmund sank down onto the altar steps, put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. You realized he was crying. "I don't know anymore," he said quietly. "I don't know anything anymore." The service ended there. People filed out silently, not looking at each other. You walked home feeling like something fundamental had broken, like the last pillar holding up the structure of your world had finally crumbled. Father Edmund died 3 days later. The plague took him, fast fever in the morning, buboes by afternoon, death before dawn the next day. You helped bury him in the new cemetery, in the very field where he'd buried so many others. There was no one left to say the proper words over him, so you did your best, stumbling through half-remembered prayers, probably getting everything wrong, but doing it anyway because someone had to. Without a priest, the church stood empty. The bells stopped ringing. The rhythms that had structured time matins, vespers, all the daily prayers disappeared. Sundays became indistinguishable from Tuesdays. Holy days passed unmarked. The connection to God, to the church, to the larger world of Christendom, it all just faded away. And with it went the last pretense of order. By the time September comes, the wave of deaths has slowed. Not stopped. People are still falling sick, still dying, but the worst of it seems to have passed. Out of the 200 people who lived in Ashwell at the start of summer, perhaps 70 remain. You've lost more than half your population in 3 months. 3 months. It seems impossible, yet here you are, one of the survivors, looking around at the devastation and trying to understand how the world can have changed so completely in such a short time. You're still alive. Eleanor's still alive. Margaret and William are still alive. Against all odds, against all probability, your immediate family has survived intact. You should feel grateful. You do feel grateful. But the guilt of survival weighs on you too. Why did you live when so many others died? What made you special? What made your children more deserving of life than all the other children now lying in the churchyard? There are no good answers to these questions. Father Edmund talked about God's mysterious ways, about how the Lord has a plan for everyone and we must trust in his wisdom. But it's hard to trust in a wisdom that takes children and spares adults, that kills the righteous and spares the wicked. It seems completely random in its choices. Maybe that's the hardest part. Not the death itself. Death has always been a part of life, especially in a village like Ashwell, but the randomness of it, the complete lack of logic or justice or meaning. If this is God's punishment, then who is he punishing and why? If this is nature running its course, then what course? What purpose does this serve? You don't have answers. Nobody does. So you do what humans have always done in the face of the incomprehensible. You endure. You wake up each morning and you be grateful to be alive, and you try not to think too much about what tomorrow might bring. That's all you can do. That's all anyone can do. The question that dominates every hour of every day is simple and overwhelming. How do you survive when the world is ending? Because that's what it feels like. The world is ending. Not in fire or flood or some dramatic apocalyptic event, but in this slow grinding collapse where each day brings new losses, new horrors, new impossible choices. And yet life continues. It has to. The basic needs of survival don't stop just because there's a plague ravaging the country. You still need to eat. You still need water. You still need shelter and warmth, and all the other things that keep a body alive. So you develop routines, strategies for survival in a world that feels fundamentally hostile. Water is the first challenge. In normal times, you get water from the village well or from the stream that runs past the mill. But now these communal spaces feel dangerous. You've heard the theories about poisoned wells, about bad air hovering over standing water, about infection spreading through contact. Maybe none of it is true. Probably none of it is true. But maybe isn't a risk you can afford to take. So you send Eleanor to fetch water before dawn, when the village is still dark and quiet and empty, when there's less chance of encountering anyone who might be sick. She goes alone, hurrying through the gray pre-morning light with 2 buckets, filling them quickly and coming straight back home. Sometimes she sees other women doing the same thing, all of them moving like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, maintaining distance. The well itself looks different now, somehow, menacing, like it might reach out and grab you if you get too close. You know that's irrational. It's just a well, just stones and water, but rationality has little place in your thoughts these days. Everything feels dangerous. Everything could be the thing that kills you. Food is harder. Your garden behind the cottage has provided some vegetables, beans and cabbages and onions, but it's not enough to feed 4 people. In normal times, you'd buy bread from the baker or grain from the mill to grind into flour yourselves. You'd trade with your neighbor's eggs for cheese, labor for a share of someone's harvest. But the baker is dead. The mill stands idle. Most of your neighbors are either dead or too frightened to open their doors. The fields are full of unharvested wheat, and technically that wheat belongs to Sir Robert, but Sir Robert isn't here, and there is no one to stop you from taking what you need. So you do. You're not the only one. Every surviving family in Ashwell is out in those fields now, cutting wheat with whatever tools they can find, gathering it up, hauling it home. It feels like theft even though it's not, even though Sir Robert owes you this and more after everything you've given him in labor and taxes over the years. The wheat needs to be threshed to separate the grain from the chaff and ground into flour. Normally you'd take it to the mill, but the mill isn't operating. So you do it by hand, using a stone to grind the grain a little at a time. An exhausting process that leaves your arms aching and produces flour that's coarse and gritty, but edible. Eleanor bakes bread once a week, coarse, heavy loaves that are nothing like the fine white bread of the wealthy, but that fill your belly and keep you alive. You've killed Grunter. You had to. The pig was your insurance policy, the animal you were raising to slaughter in the fall, so you'd have meat through the winter. But fall is a long way off, and you re-hungry now, and who knows if you even survive to see the fall. So Grunter became dinner, and breakfast, and dinner again, salted and smoked, and stretched out over as many meals as possible. The day you killed him, William cried. He'd named the pig, played with it, treated it almost like a pet, even though everyone told him not to get attached, because that's what pigs are for eventually. But he's only 3, and 3-year-olds don't understand these things. Don't understand the calculus of survival that says a piggy's life is worth less than a human S. Why did you kill Grunter, Papa? He asked, tears streaming down his face. Because we need to eat, you said, as gently as you could. Because Grunter can help keep us alive. But I don't want to eat Grunter. I want Grunter to stay. You didn't know what to say to that. How do you explain to a child that sometimes you have to do terrible things to survive, that the world isn't fair, that it's cruel, that it takes and gives back nothing but suffering? Eleanor held William while he cried, rocked him and sang to him, and eventually he fell asleep, exhausted by grief. And that night you ate pork stew, thick and rich with fat, the most substantial meal you'd had in weeks. It tasted like guilt and necessity mixed together. The chickens are still alive, still laying eggs. Thank God. 3 eggs every other day or so, a precious source of protein. You guard those chickens like they're made of gold, keeping them inside at night, now instead of letting them roost outside. Because there are wild dogs roaming the village, animals that once belonged to people who are now dead, and those dogs are hungry too. You saw one of them yesterday, a spotted hound that used to belong to Martin. It was thin, ribs showing through its coat, and it was eating something in the middle of the road. You got closer to see what it was, and then you wished you hadn't. A rat. The dog was eating a dead rat, tearing at the carcass with desperate hunger. You chased the dog away, threw stones at it until it ran off into the empty fields. Then you looked at the rat for a long moment, this small dead thing that somehow carried death in its blood, that somehow spread the sickness from place to place and person to person, though you don't know that's true, can't know it, can only suspect. The rat looked ordinary, just a rat. Nothing special or evil about it. And yet, you buried it, scratching a shallow hole in the dirt with a stick and kicking the carcass in and covering it over. Probably pointless. Probably the damage was already done. But it made you feel like you'd accomplished something, like you'd fought back in some small way against the invisible enemy. Keeping the children occupied is its own challenge. Margaret and William don't fully understand what's happening. They know that people are dying. They've seen the fear on everyone's faces, but they don't grasp the scope of it, the sheer terror and grief that adults are feeling. That's probably good. Let them stay innocent a little longer. But they're restless from being cooped up inside all the time. They want to play with their friends, want to go outside, want things to be normal again. You and Eleanor try to keep them entertained with games and stories, but it's hard when you're both so exhausted, so wrung out with fear and grief, so constantly vigilant for any sign that the sickness has found its way into your home. You teach William his letters sometimes, scratching them in the dirt floor with a stick. A, B, C. You're not educated yourself. You can't read or write, but you know the shapes of the letters. And maybe someday, William will have the opportunity to learn properly, to become something more than a farmer. That future seems impossibly distant right now, but you try to hold on to hope anyway. Try to believe that there will be a someday, that this nightmare will end and normal life will resume. Eleanor tells the children stories in the evenings, old tales passed down through generations. Stories of saints and miracles, of brave knights and clever peasants, of happier times in a world that seems like it might have been imaginary. So far away does it feel now. The children listen, wide-eyed in the firelight, and for a little while they forget to be scared. Margaret asks questions sometimes. Where did Sarah go? That's her friend, the blacksmith's daughter, who died 2 weeks ago. She's with God now, Eleanor says, using the answer adults always give children. Will she come back? No, sweetheart. When people go to God, they don't come back. Will we go to God? Eleanor's face tightens. Not for a very long time, she says, with more confidence than she feels. We're going to stay here, and we're going to be fine. Promise? Eleanor glances at you, her eyes asking a question you can't answer. I promise, she says finally, and you both know it's a lie, that nobody can promise anything in this world. But what else can you tell a child? That tomorrow isn't promised. That death could come for any of you at any moment? No, let them have their illusions. Let them believe in promises and tomorrows and happy endings. At night, after the children are asleep, you and Eleanor sometimes talk about what comes next. If the plague ends when the plague ends, you try to tell yourself. When not, if what will life look like? The village is devastated, so many people dead, so much knowledge and skill lost. Who will run the mill? Who will work the forge? Who will lead the church services if another priest never comes? We could leave, Eleanor says again one night. Start over somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't touched as badly. And abandon our land, you ask? Abandon our home? What home? She says, and there's bitterness in her voice now, a sharp edge you're not used to hearing from her. Everyone's dead, Tom. Everyone we knew. Everyone we loved. What's keeping us here except habit? She's not wrong. Your parents are dead. They died years ago, before the plague. Eleanor's parents are dead too, taken by the sickness just last month. Your brother, your only sibling, dead. Eleanor's sisters, both dead. Your friends, your neighbors, the whole intricate web of relationships that made up your world, mostly gone now, torn apart, scattered to the wind. I don't know, you admit finally. I don't know what we should do. And that's the truth, the scary truth. You don't know. The future is a blank space, impossible to imagine, much less plan for. So you don't plan. You just survive one day at a time, trying not to think too far ahead because thinking ahead leads to despair, and despair leads nowhere good. Some days are better than others. There are moments, brief, precious moments, when you almost feel normal. When the sun is warm on your face and the children are laughing, and Eleanor smiles at something you said, and for just a heartbeat or two you forget about the plague, forget about death, forget about everything, except this moment right now. But those moments never last. Always, always, reality crashes back in. You remember where you are, what's happening, what you've lost. The grief is always there, just beneath the surface, ready to pull you under if you let your guard down. You find yourself thinking about the dead at odd times. In the middle of some mundane task, drawing water, or mending a fence, or pulling weeds, suddenly you'll remember Peter. Remember his laugh, or the way he used to scratch his beard when he was thinking, and the loss will hit you like a physical blow. He's gone. He's really gone. You'll never see him again, never share a drink with him again, never hear his voice again. The list of the dead grows longer every day, a litany of names that you recite to yourself sometimes, as if by remembering them, you can somehow keep them alive. Martin and his wife Joan, Robert and his father Sir Robert, who returned from wherever he fled, only to sicken and die within days. Alice, the church cleaner. Henry the boaster. John's wife Sarah. Their children Emma and Thomas Little Thomas, named after you, who used to follow you around the village asking questions about everything. Gone now. All gone. You wonder sometimes if you're going mad. The weight of it all, the constant fear and grief and exhaustion. Surely no one could endure this and remain entirely sane? Maybe you've already crossed some invisible line. Maybe you're already broken in ways you can't see yet. Maybe everyone is. But then you look at children and you pull yourself back from that edge. For them, you have to stay sane for them. You have to keep going, keep fighting, keep surviving, because they need you and you cannot, will not, abandon them to this horror. So you do what needs to be done. Every day you wake up and you check that everyone is still healthy, and you say a prayer of thanks, and then you get to work. Fetching water, finding food, maintaining the house as best you can with limited tools and energy, keeping the children safe and occupied, burying the dead when it's your turn, because the work of burial has to be shared among the few men still able to do it. The graves have long since filled the churchyard. Father Edmund consecrated a new burial ground in a field beyond the village, and that's where the dead go now, laid in trenches instead of individual graves, because there are too many, and not enough time or energy to dig proper graves for them all. You've helped dig these mass graves, helped lower bodies wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared old blankets, torn tunics, sometimes just bare skin, because there's nothing left to wrap them in. It's grim work, soul-crushing work, but someone has to do it. The alternative is to leave the bodies to rot where they lie, and that's unthinkable. Even in the midst of catastrophe, even when everything else has collapsed, you still owe the dead the dignity of burial. Father Edmund performed abbreviated services before he died, too tired and overwhelmed to do the full rites for everyone. After his death, you and the other survivors did your best, saying what prayers you could remember, making the sign of the cross, trying to give the dead some measure of proper farewell, even without a priest to guide you. Time takes on a strange quality during these months. Days blur together, each one much like the last. The calendar loses meaning. What is the point of knowing whether it is Thursday or Friday, when the only thing that matters is surviving until tomorrow? The church bells have stopped ringing, so even that marker of time is gone. The seasons continue their ancient rhythm, indifferent to human suffering. Summer fades into autumn. The days grow shorter. The nights grow colder. In a normal year, this would be harvest time, the busiest time, the whole village working together to bring in the crops before the first frost. But this isn't a normal year, and most of the crops lie rotting in the fields because there aren't enough people left to harvest them. What you can harvest, you do. Every surviving family works their own land now, Sir Robert's claims forgotten or ignored. You cut what wheat you can reach, thresh it, store it. You dig up potatoes and carrots from abandoned gardens, taking what you need, because it's better that someone eats them than they go to waste. You pick apples from trees that once belonged to people now dead, and you don't feel guilty about it, because guilt is a luxury you can't afford. The weather turns colder. You need to prepare for winter, but you're so tired, so depleted, so emotionally and physically exhausted that even thinking about winter preparation is overwhelming. Firewood to cut and stack, food to preserve, gaps in the cottage walls to be filled before the cold really sets in. All the normal autumn work multiplied by the fact that there's no one to help you, no one to trade labor with, just you doing it alone or with Eleanor's help, struggling to accomplish in days what normally took weeks of communal effort. Some nights you lie awake and do the calculations. How much food do you have? How much firewood? How many days will it last? Assuming 4 people, assuming you can stretch it and supplement it with whatever else you can find. The numbers are frightening. Even if the plague ends tomorrow, even if no one else dies, survival this winter is going to be a close thing. But the plague doesn't end. It slows. Yes, fewer new cases, longer gaps between deaths, but it doesn't stop. Just when you start to hope, start to think maybe it's over, someone else falls sick, someone else dies, the terror never fully lifts. It just becomes familiar, becomes normal, becomes the constant background noise of your existence. And through it all, somehow, impossibly, you keep going. The laws stopped being enforced because there was no one left to enforce them. Sir Robert was dead. He returned from wherever he fled to collect some belongings, and had fallen sick within days, dying in his own manor house with no one to tend him except a single terrified servant who fled the moment Sir Robert breathed his last. His steward was dead. The reeve who collected rents and settled disputes was dead. The constables who kept the peace were dead. The whole apparatus of medieval government, from the manor level right up to the king, all of it had collapsed or retreated or simply ceased to function. This created a strange sort of freedom. Suddenly, you weren't bound to the land anymore. The labor you owed Sir Robert, the rents you were supposed to pay, the restrictions on where you could go and what you could do, none of it mattered now because there was no one left to enforce it. You could leave Ashwell if you wanted. You could take whatever land you wanted. You could refuse the old obligations, and no one could stop you. But freedom without structure is just chaos. And chaos, you discovered, is terrifying. With no one enforcing property rights, people started taking whatever they could. Abandoned houses were broken into, their contents carried off. Tools went missing. Food stores were raided. The carefully maintained boundaries between different family sere strips of land became meaningless as everyone grabbed whatever they could reach. You watched one afternoon as two men argued over a plow. The plow had belonged to Martin, who died a month ago along with his entire family. Now Stephen claimed it because he'd lent Martin money years ago and had never been repaid. But William claimed it because his field bordered Martin S., and he helped Martin repair the plow last spring, and that should count for something. The argument escalated. Voices rose. Stephen shoved William. William shoved back. And then suddenly, they were really fighting fists, and then grappling on the ground. And Stephen grabbed a rock, and you thought he was actually going to bash William's head in, until you and two other men pulled them apart. "It's just a plow," you shouted, holding Stephen back while he struggled and cursed. "It's just a bloody plow. Is it worth killing each other over?" But of course, it wasn't about the plow. It was about fairness and rights, and the feeling that everything was spinning out of control. And if you could just hold on to something, claim something, own something, maybe you'd feel less like you were falling into an abyss. In the end, Stephen got the plow because he was bigger and meaner and more willing to fight for it. William stalked off, nursing a split lip and muttering threats. 2 weeks later, William was dead of plague, and you wondered if Stephen felt guilty about the plow, about those last angry words between them. Probably not. Probably Stephen didn't have room for guilt anymore. None of you did. Arguments like this happened constantly now. Who owned what? Who had rights to which land? Who should inherit the possessions of the dead? Without the Lord Steward to settle disputes, without the church to provide moral guidance, without any structure of authority, every disagreement became a potential flashpoint for violence. Women traveling alone became targets. You heard whispers. Some man from a nearby village attacked a woman gathering firewood, would have raped her if she hadn't fought back hard enough to escape. The old rules protecting women, the social contracts that made life bearable, these were breaking down too, revealing ugly truths that had always been there, but were usually kept hidden under the veneer of civilization. Eleanor stopped going to fetch water alone. You insisted on going with her, standing guard while she filled the buckets, watching the shadows, watching for threats that might not come, but that you couldn't risk ignoring. She didn't argue. She'd heard the same whispers you had. She knew what men were capable of when all restraints had been removed. The children were the most visible victims of this collapse. Orphans wandered the village like feral cats, dirty and hungry and increasingly wild. Some families took them in out of charity or duty, but most people had nothing to spare, were barely surviving themselves, couldn't take on additional mouths to feed. So the orphans fended for themselves, stealing food where they could, sleeping in abandoned houses, forming little packs for protection and companionship. You saw a group of 5 of them one day, children ranging from maybe 6 to 12 years old, fighting over something in the street. You got closer to see what it was, and your stomach turned. A rat. A dead rat. They were fighting over a dead rat, and the eldest child a girl you vaguely recognized as someone's daughter, though you couldn't remember who's won the fight, and bit into the raw flesh while the others watched with hungry, desperate eyes. You went home and told Eleanor, and she cried, actually cried, which she hadn't done in weeks, despite everything that had happened. "We have to help them," she said. "Tom, we have to do something. We can barely feed ourselves," you said. But even as you said it, you knew you'd give in. How could you not? They were children. Someone's children, orphaned by this catastrophe, surviving in ways that no child should have to survive. You gathered what food you could spare: a half loaf of bread, some dried beans, 3 apples from the abandoned orchard, and Eleanor found the children huddled in what used to be Peter the Miller's house. She gave them the food, and they fell on it like animals, stuffing it into their mouths, barely chewing. And then it was gone, and they were still hungry, and you still had nothing more to give. "Thank you, mistress," the oldest girl said, and her voice was hoarse, her eyes too old for her young face. "God bless you." Eleanor came home and sat by the fire and didn't speak for hours. What was there to say? You'd done something, which was more than most people were doing, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Those children would still be hungry tomorrow, and the day after, and eventually they'd either find more food or they'd die, and there was nothing you could do about it except try not to think about it too much. The moral weight of these choices crushed you. Who deserved to live and who deserved to die? How could you help others when helping them might mean your own family starving? What obligations did you owe to your community when the community itself was fragmenting, falling apart? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were immediate, practical, life and death decisions you had to make every single day. Share your food or hoard it? Let strangers into your house or turn them away? Trust your neighbors or assume they might rob you the moment your back is turned? You tried to maintain some standards, some remnants of decency and community. You shared what little you had when you absolutely couldn't stand not to. You helped bury the dead even when you were exhausted beyond measure. You intervened when you saw violence, at least when you thought you had any chance of making a difference without getting killed yourself. But increasingly, you withdrew. Everyone did. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes, trusted no one, spoke to no one. The communal life that had defined Ashwell for generations, the shared work and shared festivals, and shared joys and sorrows, all of it evaporated. You became isolated, atomized, each family a tiny island in a sea of fear and death. The village green, once the heart of community life, stood empty. The tavern never opened Peter's wife had died, and no one saw any point in continuing the business. The marketplace, where traveling merchants used to set up their stalls, was deserted. No merchants came anymore. Why would they? What was there to buy? Who had money? Who had goods to trade? Even language started to break down in strange ways. You found yourself talking less, both to Eleanor and to anyone else you encountered. Words felt increasingly inadequate to describe what you were experiencing. How do you talk about watching your whole world die? What vocabulary exists for this? So you stayed silent more often than not, and so did everyone else. And the village that had once buzzed with conversation and gossip and argument fell into a heavy, oppressive quiet. The only sounds now were the wind in the empty houses, the cries of crows circling overhead, the occasional bark of feral dogs. Human sounds had faded away, replaced by the sounds of abandonment and decay. The animals sensed the change too. Dogs that had been pets became wild, running in packs, scavenging from the dead. You saw them sometimes, 3 or 4 together, slinking through the village like wolves, their eyes glinting in the darkness. They weren't aggressive toward people yet, but you wondered how long that would last. How long before hunger made them brave enough to attack? Cows wandered untended through the fields, lowing pitifully, their udders swollen and painful because there was no one left to milk them. You tried to catch one once, thinking that milk would be good for the children, but the cow was half wild now and skittish, and it ran from you, crashing through fences, disappearing into the forest. Chickens and pigs roamed freely through abandoned houses, making homes in what used to be people's bedrooms. You'd walk past an empty cottage and hear the cluck of chickens inside, see a pig nosing through someone's belongings, searching for food. It was wrong, deeply wrong, this inversion of the natural order, but there was nothing to be done about it. Nature was reclaiming everything with shocking speed. Weeds grew waist-high in what had been carefully tended gardens. The roads, no longer maintained, washed out in the autumn rains, became impassable mud tracks. Houses that had stood for generations started to sag and lean as their thatched roofs rotted, and their walls crumbled from neglect. You could see it happening, this slow-motion collapse, and you were powerless to stop it. Even if you'd had the energy and the tools and the knowledge, You couldn't maintain an entire village by yourself. The work of keeping a community functioning required a community, required the shared labor of dozens of people all working together. With most of them dead, the rest scattered and isolated, the work simply didn't get done. And so Ashwell died, not all at once, but slowly, incrementally, day by day. The physical village remained, the houses and the church and the fields, but the intangible things that made it a village, the relationships and customs and shared history, these were being erased, lost like water, draining from a broken bucket. You wondered sometimes if this was happening everywhere. Was all of England falling apart like this? All of Europe? The whole world? You had no way of knowing. No travelers came through anymore. No news reached you from the outside. You were completely isolated, cut off from the larger world, with no idea whether there even was a larger world anymore, or if the whole of human civilization had collapsed into these small pockets of terrified survivors, islands of misery in an ocean of death. The nights were the worst. In the darkness with no lights except the small fire in your hearth, with the wind howling outside and strange sounds echoing through, the empty village scraping rustling sometimes. What might have been screams or might have been animals, the fear became almost unbearable. You'd lie awake, Eleanor curled against you, both of you listening to the darkness, and you'd think, this is hell. We've died and gone to hell, and this is our eternal punishment, to live forever in this nightmare, watching everything we love die, while we remain unable to change anything, unable to escape. But then morning would come. The sun would rise, indifferent and eternal. The children would wake, hungry and needing attention. And you'd get up, and you'd start another day, because what else could you do? Giving up wasn't an option. Not while Margaret and William still needed you. Not while there was still some tiny sliver of hope that this might end, that life might someday return to something resembling normal. You clung to that hope like a drowning man clings to driftwood. It was all you had. One morning in late October, you woke to find frost on the ground, the first frost of the season. Winter was coming, ready or not. You looked out at the village, at the empty houses and overgrown gardens and abandoned fields, and you felt a moment of such profound despair that it nearly drove you to your knees. How were you going to survive this? How was anyone going to survive this? But then Margaret came out of the cottage, wrapped in her thin blanket, and she saw the frost, and her face lit up with wonder. "Papa, look, everything's white, everything's beautiful." And you looked at the frost through her eyes, and yes, it was beautiful. The way it caught the morning light, the way it transformed the ordinary world into something magical and strange. Beautiful and deadly, both, like so many things in life. "Yes, sweetheart," you said, pulling her close. "It's beautiful." She smiled up at you, trusting, innocent, believing that you would keep her safe, that the world made sense, that everything would be all right. And you knew that you couldn't let her down. You couldn't give up. You had to survive, had to keep going, had to find a way through this nightmare and out the other side, because she needed you too. They all needed you too. So you would. Somehow you would. The breakdown you were witnessing wasn't unique to Ashwell. Later, when travelers began passing through again, when news from the outside world finally reached you, you'd learned that this pattern repeated itself across all of England, across all of Europe. Everywhere the plague struck, society collapsed in similar ways. The death toll was too high, the terror too overwhelming for normal structures to survive. In London, you'd hear, bodies lay in the streets for days because there weren't enough gravediggers to bury them. The city had descended into chaos, with looting and violence becoming commonplace. The king himself had fled to the countryside, abandoning his capital in its hour of greatest need. In France, entire villages stood empty, their populations completely wiped out. Travelers reported walking for miles without seeing another living soul, passing through ghost towns where doors hung open and possessions lay scattered in the streets and crops rotted in the fields. In Italy, some cities had tried to enforce quarantines, locking plague victims in their homes and posting guards to keep them there. This had led to riots, to guards being attacked, to desperate families trying to escape their own houses while infected relatives died inside. Everywhere, the same story. Death on an unimaginable scale, followed by social collapse, followed by desperate scrambling for survival. But you didn't know any of this yet. Your world had narrowed to Ashwell and its immediate surroundings. Everything beyond that was darkness, silence, mystery. You had no idea if the whole world was ending, or just your small corner of it. You had no way of knowing if anyone would survive anywhere, if human civilization itself might be collapsing entirely. This uncertainty was perhaps the worst part, not knowing, not understanding, just existing in this bubble of terror and isolation, watching your world fall apart and wondering if there was anything left beyond it. Days bled into weeks, bled into months. September gave way to October, October to November. The weather grew colder. You needed firewood, lots of it, if you were going to survive the winter. But cutting and hauling firewood was exhausting work, and there were so few men left to do it. You organized what you could. Got together with 3 other surviving men, Stephen, Robert from Sir Robert's household staff, who'd stayed behind when the family fled, and young Thomas the carpenter's son, and the 4 of you spent several days cutting wood from the forest. Working together made it possible. Working together made it bearable, almost. You could pretend for a few hours that life was normal, that this was just ordinary autumn work, that nothing had changed. But then you'd return to the village and see the empty houses and remember. The animals in the forest had changed too. Deer, normally skittish and quick to flee, had become bolder. They'd come right up to the edges of the village now, grazing in abandoned gardens, looking at you with liquid eyes that seemed almost accusing, as if asking, "What happened to you humans? Why aren't you taking care of things anymore?" The wolves were bolder too. You'd hear them at night, howling closer to the village than they'd ever come before. The old deterrents, human activity, fires, the presence of many people, these were gone now, and the wolves were testing the boundaries, seeing how close they could get. One morning you found tracks right in the middle of the village green. Wolf tracks, large ones, possibly from a whole pack. They'd been here during the night, walking openly through what should have been human territory. You followed the tracks, and they led to the abandoned house that had belonged to Martin's family. And inside, you found what the wolves had been after. A body, someone you didn't recognize, maybe a traveler who'd stopped here and died. The wolves had been at it. You won't describe what you saw, because you're trying to forget it, trying to push the image out of your mind, but it was bad. Bad enough that you had nightmares about it for weeks. You buried what remained, did it yourself, because you couldn't ask anyone else to look at that. Covered the grave with heavy stones to keep the wolves from digging it up again. Said a prayer, though you weren't sure anymore who you were praying to, or if anyone was listening. The psychological weight of all this accumulated slowly, like snow piling up on a roof, until the whole structure groans under the load. You weren't the same person you'd been 6 months ago. How could you be? You'd seen too much, lost too much, been through too much. Eleanor wasn't the same either. None of the survivors were. You'd all been fundamentally changed by what you'd experienced, marked by it in ways that would never fully heal. Sometimes you'd look at the other survivors, and you could see it in their eyes, that same haunted, hollowed-out look that you knew was in your own eyes too. You were all walking wounded, all carrying invisible scars, all trying to figure out how to keep living in a world that no longer made sense. But you kept trying. What else could you do? Winter came, cold and dark and long. You huddled in your cottage with your family, conserving resources, telling stories, waiting for spring. The children grew restless, cooped up inside for so long, but you couldn't let them out much. Too dangerous. Too cold. Too uncertain. On Christmas Day, you think it was Christmas Day? Though without the church bells and the priest's calendar, you can't be entirely sure. Eleanor made a special meal. She'd been saving a bit of pork from Grunter, and she cooked it with the last of the autumn apples and some precious honey that she found in an abandoned house. It was the best meal you'd had in months, and for a little while, sitting around the fire eating this feast, you could almost pretend things were normal. William asked if Father Christmas would come. He'd heard stories from older children about Father Christmas bringing gifts to good children on Christmas night. Eleanor and you exchanged looks. "Not this year, sweetheart," Eleanor said gently. "Father Christmas couldn't find us this year. The roads are too difficult. Will he come next year? Maybe, if we're very good and very patient." William seemed to accept this, and you felt your heart break a little bit. Such small disappointments in the midst of such vast catastrophe. But maybe the small disappointments were the hardest, in a way. The big things, the deaths, the fear, the collapse of everything, these were so overwhelming you could almost become numb to them. But disappointing your child about Father Christmas? That felt immediate and sharp and unbearable. After the meal, you sat by the fire and Eleanor sang. She had a beautiful voice, your wife, and she knew all the old songs, the ones her mother had taught her and her grandmother before that. She sang about shepherds and angels and a baby born in a stable, and her voice filled the small cottage with something like peace. Margaret fell asleep in your lap. William curled up next to Eleanor, and you sat there listening to your wife sing and feeling, for just this moment, blessed. Blessed to be alive. Blessed to have these people. Blessed to have this small, warm place in a cold and hostile world. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more fears, more grinding work of survival. But tonight, just for tonight, you had this. And that was enough. When the world stops making sense, when everything you thought you understood reveals itself as illusion, people reach for explanations. They need to believe that there's some reason, some purpose, some logic behind the suffering. The alternative that this is all random, meaningless, chaos without cause is too terrifying to accept. So the theories multiplied, each one an attempt to restore meaning to a world that had lost it. The most common theory, the one you heard over and over, was that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. This made a certain kind of sense. God is just, God is powerful, God has a plan. Therefore, if terrible things are happening, they must be happening for a reason. They must be punishment for something. But punishment for what? That's where the logic broke down, where the comfortable certainties started to crumble. Everyone had their own answer. Father Edmund, before he died, had preached about the general wickedness of mankind, about pride and greed and lust, and all the other sins that humans are heir to. Some people pointed to specific evils, the corrupt church, the greedy nobles, the wars between kings. Some said it was the fault of women, always the fault of women, because hadn't Eve brought sin into the world in the first place? But none of these explanations held up under scrutiny. If the plague was God's punishment for sin, then why did it kill babies who'd never had the chance to sin? Why did it take devout priests like Father Edmund, who dedicated their entire lives to God's service? Why did it spare known criminals and troublemakers while killing saints? The randomness didn't fit. The indiscriminate nature of the death toll didn't match the theory of divine punishment. Unless God was arbitrary and cruel, which was a thought most people could unbear to think, because if God was arbitrary and cruel, then what hope was there for anyone? Some people clung to the faith-based explanation anyway, because they needed to, because without it, they had nothing. You saw them in the empty church sometimes, kneeling before the altar, even though there was no priest to lead them, praying fervently to a God who seemed not to be listening. Praying because prayer was all they had left, the only action they could take that might make a difference. Others abandoned faith entirely. You heard bitter laughter and angry denunciations, though usually whispered, usually late at night when people thought no one was listening. Where was God when children died? Where was God when decent people suffered? If he existed at all, he was a monster, a tyrant who toyed with humans for his own amusement. Better to acknowledge his absence than to worship such a being. These crisis of faith conversations happened in whispers, late at night, people afraid to speak too loudly because maybe God was listening and maybe he'd punish them for their doubt. But the doubt was there. You felt it yourself, though you tried not to examine it too closely. The comfortable certainties you'd grown up with. God is good, God is just. God has a plan. These were hard to maintain while watching your world burn. Your own faith had become something fragile and confused. You still prayed, but your prayers felt hollow, like shouting into a void. You still crossed yourself and attended the empty church when you could, but it was habit more than conviction. You didn't know what you believed anymore. You didn't know if God existed, or if he cared, or if prayer made any difference at all. But you kept doing it anyway, because what else was there? Because even meaningless ritual was better than the terrifying alternative of admitting that you were completely alone in an uncaring universe, that there was no plan, no purpose, no point to any of this except random suffering. So you looked for other explanations too. Natural causes, people said. Miasma, bad air, corrupted atmosphere. Maybe there'd been earthquakes or volcanoes somewhere, releasing poisonous vapors into the air. Maybe the alignment of planets had caused some atmospheric disturbance. Maybe it was just bad luck, the way weather was sometimes good and sometimes bad, through no one's fault. These explanations were less emotionally satisfying. They offered no one to pray to, no way to make it better through good behavior, but they had the advantage of not requiring you to believe in a God who would do this deliberately. You could maintain your faith by deciding that the plague was natural and that God was grieving alongside his children, powerless to intervene because he'd set the world in motion and couldn't just change the rules every time something went wrong. Was this theologically sound? Probably not. Did it help you sleep at night? Sometimes. The need to blame someone, something, anything became overwhelming. Evil had entered the world and it needed a source, a culprit, a responsible party. If it was just random bacteria, a concept you would understand for another 500 years, then that meant no one was in control, that life was fundamentally meaningless, that suffering had no purpose, unacceptable. So people found scapegoats. The Jews were the most common target, as they'd been for centuries whenever disaster struck. Never mind that there were no Jews in England anymore. Hadn't been since King Edward expelled them back in 1290. The rumors persisted anyway. Jews in France or Germany or somewhere had poisoned the wells, had conspired with Satan to destroy Christendom, had brought down God's wrath on the innocent. You heard stories, terrible stories that you hoped were untrue, but suspected were of Jewish communities being massacred across Europe. Entire populations burned alive in their synagogues, or dragged into town squares and slaughtered, or thrown into rivers to drown. Thousands of people murdered not because they'd done anything wrong, but because their Christian neighbors needed someone to blame, and Jews had always been convenient targets for that blame. The fact that Jews were dying of plague too, at the same rates as Christians, didn't seem to matter to the mobs. Logic had no place in this. People wanted blood, wanted revenge, wanted to strike out at something because they were so powerless against the disease itself. Other minorities suffered too. Beggars, lepers, foreigners, anyone who was different, anyone who was vulnerable, anyone who could be scapegoated without much risk of retaliation. You heard about villages hunting down and killing their local beggar, convinced that he'd brought the plague with him. About lepers being driven from their hospitals, left to die in ditches, because surely their disease and the plague must be connected somehow. This descent into violence was horrifying, but also, you were ashamed to admit, understandable. When you're terrified and helpless, and everyone you love is dying, you become capable of terrible things. The thin layer of civilization that normally constrains human behavior, that's eroded by catastrophe, worn away by suffering, until what's left is just the raw animal underneath, desperate and dangerous. You tried not to participate in this. When talk in the village turned to finding someone to blame, you stayed silent, or occasionally objected weakly, though you never objected too loudly, because you didn't want to make yourself a target. Self-preservation trumped moral courage, and you felt guilty about that, but not guilty enough to change it. The procession started sometime in October, groups of people marching through the countryside, flagellating themselves with whips and chains, crying out for God's mercy. They were called the flagellants, these men, and they believed that by inflicting pain on themselves, by shedding their own blood, they could somehow atone for humanity's sins and convince God to end the plague. A group of 20 or so came through Ashwell one gray morning, and you stood with a handful of other survivors watching them pass. They were a disturbing sight, half naked, covered in whip marks and dried blood, their faces ecstatic with religious fervor. They chanted as they walked called-out prayers in a language you didn't understand, stopped occasionally in the middle of the road to whip themselves harder, to cry out more loudly, to make absolutely sure God could see and hear their suffering. Part of you wanted to join them. The impulse was strong, almost overwhelming. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe if you suffered enough, if you proved your devotion through pain, God would relent. It would be something to do, at least. An action to take. A way to feel like you had some control over what was happening. But another part of you, the tired, cynical part that had seen too much death, recognized the flagellants for what they were. Desperate people grasping at desperate solutions, performing theater for themselves more than for God. If self-inflicted pain could end the plague, wouldn't it have worked by now? How many thousands of flagellants were marching through Europe, all whipping themselves bloody, and yet the dying continued? The flagellants stayed in Ashwell for 2 days, sleeping in the abandoned houses, eating what little food could be spared, performing their rituals morning and evening. Some villagers joined them. Old Henry's nephew, who'd lost his entire family. A young woman whose name you didn't know, who seemed half mad with grief. They stripped off their clothes and took up whips and joined the procession. And you watched them go with a mixture of pity and envy. At least they'd found something to believe in. At least they'd found a community, a purpose, even if that purpose was pain. Then the flagellants moved on, heading toward the next village, leaving Ashwell quieter than ever, emptier than ever. You never found out what happened to Henry's nephew or that young woman. Probably they died somewhere down the road. Probably most of the flagellants died, because they were exposing themselves constantly to infection, moving from place to place, living in close quarters, touching the sick when they passed through plague-ridden towns. But at least they died believing they were doing something meaningful. At least they died with purpose. Was that better or worse than just surviving day by day, with no meaning and no hope, and no understanding of why this was happening? You didn't know. You still don't know. Alongside the theological explanations and the scapegoating and the self-flagellation, there were also folk remedies, superstitions, desperate acts of sympathetic magic that people clung to because they needed to believe something would work. Old Marjorie, before she died, had distributed bundles of herbs that were supposed to ward off the plague. Rue and wormwood, and something else you couldn't identify. You were supposed to carry them with you, smell them constantly, breathe nothing but their scent, because clean-smelling air must be safe air. Did it work? Of course not. But people carried the herbs anyway, because it made them feel like they were doing something, taking precautions, protecting themselves. Other remedies were stranger, darker. There was a man who came through from the next village, claiming to have a jar containing a basilisk's tooth, and that if you looked at this tooth during the full moon, it would cure any disease. He charged outrageous prices to view this supposed miracle object, and people paid because what else were they going to do with their money? If you're dying anyway, might as well spend it on the slim chance of survival. You heard of someone who'd killed a toad, dried it in the sun, ground it into powder, and mixed it with wine as a cure. Of someone else who wore a live chicken strapped to their chest, believing the chicken would absorb the disease. Of people drinking their own urine, or rubbing themselves with mercury, or sleeping with Bible pages pinned inside their clothing, because surely the Word of God must have some power against evil. None of it worked. How could it? These were the flailing attempts of a people who had no understanding of germ theory, of bacteria, of how disease actually spreads, and what it actually is. They were fighting an invisible enemy with the wrong weapons, striking out blindly in the darkness, hitting nothing but shadows. And yet, you couldn't quite bring yourself to dismiss all of it as foolishness. Because what was the alternative? To do nothing? To just wait passively for death? At least these remedies, these rituals, these desperate acts, at least they gave people something to do. At least they provided the illusion of agency in a situation where you had none. You carried your own talisman, though you were almost embarrassed to admit it. A small wooden cross that Eleanor had given you when you were married. Nothing special, just a bit of oak-shaped and carved by her father's hands. You kept it in your pocket, and you touched it sometimes, running your fingers over its rough surface. And you didn't exactly pray to it, but you did something. Drew strength from it, maybe. Or just comfort from having a physical object to hold on to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Was that superstition? Faith? Just human nature seeking comfort wherever it could be found? You weren't sure it mattered. The cross didn't protect you from the plague. It didn't save anyone. But it made you feel a little less alone, a little less adrift, and maybe that was enough. The hope you clung to was fragile and irrational. It had to be, because rational hope had died weeks ago. Rationally, you should have given up. The odds were overwhelming. The death toll was staggering. Everything suggested that you and your family were living on borrowed time, that eventually the plague would find you, and that would be the end. But humans are not rational creatures, especially not in extremity. You hoped anyway. You hoped because the alternative was despair, and despair meant giving up, and you couldn't afford to give up while Margaret and William still needed you. You hoped because every morning you woke up alive felt like a small miracle, a gift, proof that maybe you really would survive this after all. The hope had no foundation, no logic, no reason. It was just stubbornness masquerading as optimism, a refusal to accept the obvious, to bow to the inevitable. But it kept you going. It kept all of you going, the handful of survivors who remained in Ashwell, who refused to flee or to die or to surrender. You were the stubborn ones, the lucky ones, the ones who, for whatever inexplicable reason, the plague couldn't seem to touch. And so you kept going, kept surviving, kept hoping against hope that someday, somehow, this nightmare would end and life would begin again. By November, you noticed something. The deaths were slowing. Not stopping, people were still falling sick, still dying, but the wave of death that had crashed over Ashwell in the summer had become a trickle. Days would go by now without anyone dying, sometimes a whole week. You were afraid to hope, afraid to believe that the worst might actually be over. How many times had it seemed like things were improving, only to have the plague surge back with renewed fury? How many times had you let yourself believe in a future, only to have it snatched away? But the days kept passing, and the deaths kept slowing, and by December, you allowed yourself to think the thought you'd been afraid to think for months. Maybe we're going to survive this. Maybe we're actually going to make it through. The plague didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whimper, with a gradual tapering off of new cases, with longer and longer stretches between deaths, until finally, tentatively, you realized that weeks had passed since anyone fell ill. It was early January 1349, 7 months since Geoffrey the wool merchant had collapsed in the village green. 7 months of terror and death and grief. And now, silence. Not a good silence. Not a peaceful silence, but silence nonetheless. You stood in the village green on a cold winter morning, your breath fogging in the air, looking around at what remained of Ashwell. Empty houses, their shutters hanging crooked, their doors standing open. Gardens overgrown with dead weeds. The church tower rising against the gray sky, its bells silent now, and probably forever. There were perhaps 60 people left in Ashwell, out of the 200 who'd lived here a year ago. 60 survivors scattered across a landscape of loss. You'd see them occasionally, moving like ghosts through the empty streets, hollow-eyed and haunted. Sometimes you'd exchange nods. Sometimes you'd talk briefly about practical matters, who had seed for planting, who needed help repairing a roof, how much food remained in various households. But mostly you avoided each other. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was something stranger and sadder. You'd all survived, and that survival came with a weight of guilt that was hard to bear. Why you? Why not the others? What made you special? Nothing, that was the answer. Nothing at all. You'd lived through sheer dumb luck, through the random chance of not being in the wrong place at the wrong time, through a throw of cosmic dice that meant nothing and couldn't be explained or justified. And so you drifted through your days, this strange community of survivors who'd lost everything except their lives. Your family remained intact miraculously. Eleanor, Margaret, William all healthy, all alive. This should have made you happy. It did make you happy, but the happiness was complicated, twisted up with survivors' guilt and continuing fear, and the ever-present awareness that you were living in a world that had been fundamentally broken. The work of survival took on new dimensions now. The immediate terror had passed, but the long-term challenges were just beginning. How do you rebuild a village when most of the people are dead? How do you restart the rhythms of agricultural life when there's no one left who knows how to run the mill or shoe horses, or even how to properly organize the planting? The fields lay empty, silent, covered in the frost of a late winter. In a normal year, you'd be planning for spring planting about now. Decisions about what crops to plant where, organization of communal labor for the heavy work, meetings to discuss drainage and fencing, and all the endless practical details of farming. But there was no communal labor anymore, because there was barely a community, and there was more land available than the survivors could possibly work. This became clear when you ventured out to what had been your family's strip of land and looked around at the vast acreage surrounding it. All of this had belonged to Sir Robert, had been parceled out carefully among his peasants, each family working their assigned strip and giving a portion of the harvest to the Lord as rent. But Sir Robert was dead, and his steward was dead, and his sons were dead, and the whole apparatus of manorial control had evaporated, which meant, in theory, that all this land was now yours. Not just yours, everyone's. The survivors could take whatever land they wanted, as much as they could work. There was no one to stop them, no one to enforce the old rules, no one to collect rents or demand labor, or maintain the feudal system that had structured rural life for centuries. This should have been liberating. In some ways it was, but it was also terrifying, because the old system, oppressive as it had been, had also provided structure. It had told you what to do, when to do it, how to organize your life. Without it you were adrift, making decisions you'd never had to make before, taking on responsibilities that felt overwhelming. How much land could you farm? How much did you need to feed your family? What about surplus to trade for the things you couldn't make yourself? What crops should you plant? Who could you trade labor with for the tasks that required multiple people? These questions had no clear answers. You made your best guesses, talked with other survivors, tried to formulate plans. It was exhausting. Every decision felt monumental, impossible, crucial. But you had to make them anyway. Spring was coming, whether you were ready or not. The winter passed slowly, each day much like the last. You huddled in your cottage with your family, conserving firewood, stretching your food supplies, trying not to think about how much remained to be done and how little energy you had to do it. The weather was cold but not brutal, which was a mercy. You'd half expected God to pile catastrophe upon catastrophe, to send a terrible winter on top of the plague, but he didn't. Or maybe he did, and it just felt mild compared to everything else you'd endured. Margaret and William were changing in ways you couldn't quite define. They'd survived, they were healthy, they should have been fine. But something in their eyes looked different now. Older, more knowing. They'd seen things children shouldn't see. They'd lived through horrors that would mark them for the rest of their lives. You wondered sometimes what stories they'd tell their own children someday, how they'd explain this year, what meaning they'd managed to extract from it. Eleanor was changing too. She'd always been strong, your wife, but now she was something else hardened, tempered by suffering into something more durable and less forgiving. She didn't smile as much. She didn't laugh. She moved through her days with a grim efficiency that got things done, but felt joyless, mechanical, like she was going through the motions of living without quite remembering why. You tried to talk to her about it one night, asked her if she was all right, though you knew the answer even before you asked. No, she said simply. I'm not all right. How could I be? Everything's gone, Tom. Everyone we knew, everyone we loved gone. The village is dead. Our life is dead. We're just still here, still breathing. But that's not the same as being all right. We'll rebuild, you said, though you weren't sure you believed it. We'll make a new life. She looked at you with something that might have been pity. Will we? With what? With whom? Look around. There's nothing left to build with. No community. No resources. No hope. We have each other, you offered weakly. Yes, she said. We have each other. I'm grateful for that. Don't misunderstand me. I'm grateful. But grateful isn't the same as happy. Surviving isn't the same as living. She wasn't wrong. That was the hardest part. She was absolutely, completely right, and you had no argument against it, no comfort to offer beyond the bare fact of survival itself. Spring came. March brought warmer weather and longer days, and the first green shoots pushing up through the dead grass. Time to plant, time to work, time to begin the cycle anew. You selected a piece of land more than you'd ever been allowed before, more than you could really work properly by yourself, but you took it anyway, because why not? The old rules were gone. Take what you can use, work what you can work. Claim what you can claim before someone else does. Other survivors did the same. You'd see them in the fields, scattered across the landscape, each family working alone or in small clusters, maintaining careful distance from each other. The communal farming of the old days, when 20 men would work together to plow a large field, it was gone. Now it was every family for themselves, working isolated strips with whatever tools they could scavenge from abandoned homes. The work was brutally hard. Plowing, harrowing, planting tasks that used to require many men now fell to you alone, or to you and Eleanor, working together while the children watched from the edge of the field. Your back ached constantly. Your hands were raw and blistered. You fell asleep each night, so exhausted you couldn't even dream. But the work was also strangely satisfying. It was concrete, real, something you could point to and say, I did this. I planted this grain. I'm preparing for next winter. I'm taking care of my family. After months of helplessness, of being buffeted by forces you couldn't control or understand, it felt good to be doing something productive again. The wheat you planted looked pitiful, thin scattered rows in a vast field, nothing like the dense plantings of previous years. But it was something. It was a start. It was hope in the most basic form possible, seeds in the ground, wagering that the future will exist long enough to harvest them. Around you, slowly, tentatively, the surviving villagers began to emerge from their isolation. Not back to the old ways, Those were gone forever, but into something new, something that hadn't fully taken shape yet, but that was beginning to form in the spaces between catastrophe and recovery. You'd see John the blacksmith working at his forge again, the ring of his hammer carrying across the empty village. You'd see women tending gardens, children playing cautiously in the village green. You'd hear voices occasionally, conversations happening between houses, exchanges of information or gossip, or just small talk to fill the silence. It wasn't community in the old sense. The bonds that had held Ashwell together were severed, scattered, lost. But it was something. Human beings reaching out to each other, tentatively, carefully, trying to remember how to be social creatures again. Some survivors left Ashwell entirely, deciding to try their luck elsewhere. You watched them go, families packing their possessions onto carts, walking down the road toward Bristol or London, or anywhere that wasn't here, anywhere that didn't hold so many ghosts. You understood the impulse. You felt it yourself sometimes. But you also stayed, because this was home, and leaving felt like admitting defeat, like letting the plague win completely. New people arrived too, slowly, refugees from other devastated villages, landless laborers looking for opportunity, young men and women hoping to marry and settle somewhere that wasn't quite as dead as the places they fled. They were strange, these newcomers. They didn't know the history of Ashwell, didn't know who died or how or which houses had been whose. They walked through the village with innocent eyes, seeing only empty buildings and unclaimed land, not the layers of grief and memory that you saw everywhere you looked. Part of you resented them, part of you welcomed them. Mostly you just regarded them with numb indifference, too exhausted to have strong feelings about anything anymore. Life continued. Days passed. Seasons turned. The wheat grew, slowly but steadily, and you tended it with grim determination, pulling weeds, repairing fences, praying for good weather, because a failed harvest now might mean starvation next winter. Other crops, too, beans and peas and cabbages in your garden, carefully tended by Eleanor. A new pig, purchased with coins you'd found hidden in an abandoned house, probably someone's life savings, gone to waste, because the owner died and the money sat there unused until you claimed it. 3 new chickens to replace the ones that had died or wandered off during the chaos. Piece by piece, you were rebuilding something that resembled a life. It didn't look like your old life. It would never look like that again. The people were different. The structures were different. The rules and relationships and expectations were all different. But it was life nonetheless. It was survival. It was the slow, patient work of continuing despite everything that had happened, everything that had been lost. Your children adapted better than you did. Children are resilient, everyone says, and maybe it's true. Margaret played with other children when she encountered them, apparently unbothered by the fact that many of her friends from before were gone. William learned to help with small tasks, gathering eggs and pulling weeds and carrying water, proud of his contributions to the household in ways that made your heart ache with love and sorrow mixed together. They would grow up in a different world than the one you'd grown up in. That much was certain. They would never know the Ashwell that you remembered, the village of 200 souls with its busy marketplace, and its full church and its sense of permanence and continuity stretching back generations. They would grow up in this new Ashwell, sparse and scattered and still finding its shape, where the old hierarchies had collapsed and new ones hadn't quite formed yet, where possibility and terror lived side by side. You wondered what kind of adults they would become, what kind of world they would inherit, whether they would tell their own children stories about this time, about the plague year, about the world that ended and the world that began in its place, whether those stories would be tragic or triumphant, whether they would emphasize the suffering or the survival. You hoped they would remember both. Remember the cost, but also remember that people endured, that life continued, that even the worst catastrophe eventually passed. As summer approached and the wheat began to ripen in the fields, sparse but real, a testament to your labor and your hope, you found yourself thinking more and more about the future. Not the immediate future, not the next harvest or the coming winter, but the distant future. Years from now, decades, centuries. Would anyone remember what happened in 1348? Would the plague be a story that parents told children? A historical event that people studied and tried to understand? Or would it fade, become just another forgotten tragedy? Lost to time like so many others? You didn't know. You couldn't know. But you found yourself wanting to remember, wanting to bear witness, wanting to somehow preserve the truth of what you de-experienced so that it would not be lost completely. The years passed. The sharp edges of grief gradually dulled, though they never disappeared completely. Ashwell slowly repopulated, a mixture of survivors and newcomers, building something new from the ruins of the old. The plague returned occasionally in smaller waves. You remember 1361 particularly, when another outbreak swept through, though not as severe as the first. Never as devastating as that first terrible summer of 1348, but bad enough. Each time it came back, the old fear returned too, that visceral terror you'd learned during the first outbreak. And you declose your doors and avoid contact with others, and pray that this time would pass quickly. And it did pass every time. The plague would sweep through, take its victims, and then recede again, leaving you to pick up the pieces and carry on. The social changes that began during the plague accelerated in its aftermath. With so many people dead and so much land lying empty, laborers found themselves in demand for the first time in memory. Peasants could negotiate for better wages, better conditions, more freedom. The rigid feudal system that had defined rural life for centuries began to crack and crumble. This led to conflict, of course. Laws were passed trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, trying to force peasants to stay on their assigned lands, trying to preserve the old order against the forces of change. But the laws were largely unenforceable. How could they be? The balance of power had shifted. Workers knew their worth now, knew they could demand better treatment, because if one lord refused them, another would take them on. You benefited from these changes personally. With land so abundant and labor so scarce, you accumulated more property than your father or grandfather could have dreamed of. You hired workers to help with the harvest, paying them wages that would have seemed outrageous before the plague, but that now felt reasonable, necessary. You sold surplus grain at markets and made enough money to buy luxuries, real glass for your window, an iron pot for cooking, shoes that didn't leak. Your standard of living rose significantly, ironically, as a direct result of the catastrophe that had killed so many. This felt wrong somehow, profiting from others' deaths. But what choice did you have? You had to survive. You had a family to provide for. Taking advantage of opportunities didn't mean you'd forgotten the cost. Margaret grew up, married a young man from the next village, had children of her own. She seemed happy, or as happy as anyone could be who'd lived through what she'd lived through. She never talked about the plague year, not in detail, though you could see in her eyes sometimes that she remembered, that it was always there, just beneath the surface. William grew up too, learned the blacksmith's trade from John, who'd never had children of his own, and was glad to have an apprentice. William was good at the work, patient and precise, and John doted on him like a son. When John died of old age, peacefully in his sleep, a rare mercy in these times, William took over the forge and became the village blacksmith, an important man, respected and needed. You were proud of your children, proud of the lives they'd built, the people they'd become, the way they'd managed to find happiness and purpose despite everything. They were proof that life continued, that the plague hadn't won completely, that the future was possible even when it seemed impossible. Eleanor aged beside you, her hair going gray, her face etching itself with lines that spoke of suffering and endurance. She never quite recovered her old joy, never quite became the woman she'd been before the plague. But she was there, solid and dependable. and you loved her more deeply than you'd ever thought possible. The shared experience of surviving hell had forged a bond between you that nothing could break. Sometimes in the evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet, you'd sit together by the fire and remember. Not talking, necessarily. The memories were too painful for casual conversation. But just being together, two survivors who understood each other in ways that no one else could. The village rebuilt around you, slowly becoming something that resembled a proper community again. Not the same as before, it would never be the same, but functional, alive, capable of sustaining itself. New children were born, new families formed. The church got a new priest, a young man from London who survived the plague there, and who brought a different kind of faith than Father Edmund, as had been humbler, more questioning, less certain, but perhaps more honest. The fields yielded their harvests year after year. Some years were good, some were bad, but none were as catastrophic as the hunger years before the plague. The land was rich, well rested from its years of neglect, and with fewer people to feed, food was more abundant than it had been in living memory. This abundance, combined with higher wages and more freedom, created a world that was in many ways better than the one that had existed before 1348. Life was still hard. It was always hard, but it was less brutally oppressive than it had been. People had options now, choices, a degree of control over their own lives that their ancestors would have envied. You lived to see your grandchildren, which was a blessing you'd never dared to hope for. Held them in your arms and looked into their innocent faces and thought about all the life that had been lost to make room for their existence. The plague had killed half of Europe, but it had also, paradoxically, created opportunities for those who survived. Your grandchildren would grow up in a world with more freedom, more mobility, more possibility than you'd ever known. Was that a fair trade? Of course not. Nothing could justify the loss of so many lives. But it was the reality you lived in, the world that had emerged from catastrophe, and you did your best to navigate it with as much grace and gratitude as you could muster. As you aged into your 50s, an impressive age, in a world where many people died young, you found yourself thinking more and more about meaning. What had it all meant? The plague, the suffering, the survival. Was there a purpose to any of it? A lesson to be learned? You never found a satisfying answer. The plague had been random, meaningless, a natural disaster that struck without regard for justice or virtue or any other human consideration. Good people had died and bad people had survived, and there was no pattern to it, no logic, no divine plan that you could discern. But perhaps that was the lesson in itself. That suffering doesn't need to have meaning. That catastrophe can strike without reason. That the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human concerns, and that knowledge, while terrifying, is also somehow liberating. Because if the plague taught you anything, it was that you couldn't control the world. You couldn't prevent disaster. You couldn't protect the people you loved from every threat, no matter how vigilant you were, no matter how hard you tried. All you could control was yourself, your own choices, your own response to whatever the world threw at you. And the choice you'd made, the choice all the survivors had made, was to keep going, to endure, to rebuild, to find meaning not in the catastrophe itself, but in the response to it, in the decision to continue living despite everything. That was the real triumph, you realized. Not that you'd survived survival was often just luck, but that you'd chosen to keep living afterward, to keep working and loving and hoping, even when it would have been easier to give up, to let despair win, to decide that a world this cruel wasn't worth participating in. You'd made the choice to participate anyway, to insist on life even in the face of death, to plant seeds in the ground each spring, knowing that you might not live to see the harvest, but doing it anyway, because that's what humans do. They continue. They persist. They refuse to surrender. You died in your sleep one winter night in 1411, 63 years old, surrounded by family. Eleanor had passed 5 years earlier, And you mourned her deeply, but also felt grateful that she deep in spared the infirmities of extreme old age. You'd lived a full life longer than most people could hope for, filled with both terrible suffering and genuine joy. Your last thoughts as consciousness faded were not of the plague, but of the people you'd loved, Eleanor and Margaret and William, your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the community of Ashwell, which had survived and rebuilt and continued despite everything. You'd made it. You de-survived the worst catastrophe in human memory, and you de-built a life afterward, and you de-seen your children grow and thrive, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The darkness came gently, peacefully, and you went into it without fear because you'd faced worse darkness before and survived it. Death was just another transition, another journey, and you'd never been afraid of journeys. Your story ended, but the story of Ashwell continued, and the story of the plague continued too, echoing through generations, shaping history in ways both obvious and subtle, remembered and half-forgotten, a shadow that stretched across centuries. Looking back across the vast distance of time, from our perspective in the 21st century, the Black Death of 1348 to 1349 stands as one of the most catastrophic events in human history. The numbers are staggering even now, even with centuries of distance to soften the horror. Between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died within just a few years. Estimates suggest that 25 million people perished in Europe alone, with millions more dying across Asia and Africa. Entire towns were abandoned. Villages disappeared from the map. The demographic catastrophe was so severe that Europe's population didn't return to pre-plague levels until the 17th century, 300 years later. But the plague did more than just kill people. It fundamentally transformed medieval society in ways that reverberated for centuries. The labor shortage caused by so many deaths shifted the balance of power between lords and peasants. Workers could demand higher wages, better conditions, more freedom. The rigid hierarchies of feudalism began to break down. Serfdom gradually faded. The middle class expanded. Social mobility became possible in ways it never had been before. The plague also challenged the authority of the church. If God allowed such suffering, if prayers and piety couldn't prevent death, then what was the church's purpose? Why should people accept its authority? These questions, raised during and after the plague, contributed to the religious upheavals that would culminate in the Protestant Reformation 2 centuries later. If you're listening to this now, in whatever time you live in, from whatever place you call home, you're part of that same human story. The specific catastrophes change: plague, war, famine, pandemic, economic collapse, climate disaster, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you continue when the world falls apart? How do you find meaning in suffering? How do you survive when survival seems impossible? The people of 1348 didn't have answers to these questions any more than you do. They fumbled through as best they could, making mistakes, experiencing both despair and hope, sometimes giving up, and sometimes finding unexpected reserves of strength. What they discovered, what every generation that faces catastrophe discovers, is that humans are simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. We break easily. The things we thought were permanent and solid can crumble in an instant. The people we love can be taken from us without warning. The world we know can end in ways we never anticipated, but we also endure. We adapt. We find ways to keep going, even when it seems impossible. We rebuild from ruins. We create new communities from the survivors of old ones. We insist on life, even in the face of overwhelming death. The people of Ashwell couldn't see the future. They didn't know that the plague would eventually pass, that society would rebuild, that life would continue. From their perspective, in the midst of the dying, it felt like the end of the world. It felt permanent and inescapable. But it wasn't. The plague ended. The survivors continued. Life found a way forward. Different than before, but still life, still worth living. Your catastrophe will end too, whatever form it takes. Maybe not today or tomorrow or even this year, but eventually the acute phase will pass. The crisis will resolve one way or another, and you'll be left with the question of what comes next, how to continue, how to build a life in whatever remains. So if you're settling in for the night now, maybe pulling your blanket a little closer, maybe letting your thoughts drift as this story comes to an end, I want you to know something. You're stronger than you think. The catastrophes you face or will face are survivable, even if they don't feel that way in the moment. The people of 1348 survived the plague. You can survive whatever comes for you. And when you do, when you're standing on the other side, looking back at what you've endured, you'll carry those experiences with you. They'll change you. How could they not? But they won't destroy you. You'll build a life from what remains. You'll find moments of joy amid the grief. You'll continue, just as humans have always continued, across centuries and catastrophes, enduring and adapting, and stubbornly refusing to give up. Sleep well. Dream peacefully. And remember, you're stronger than you know. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please hit that like button and subscribe to Sleepy Historians for more deep dives into the past. Drop a comment letting me know what historical topic you'd like to explore next. Until then, rest easy. The sun will rise tomorrow, as it always has, as it always will.